shout out to Lewis, but I want to tell you that somebody has come from further than Missouri to be with us, from Dubai, Anita, yeah. So, say hi to Anita if you don't know her. I want to thank the sincere thank you to the executive committee members who have worked really hard to put this together. So if the committee members would just stand super quick, we can give them a heartfelt clap. Yeah. Thank you so much. Also want to say a special thanks to the staff. I'm just going to keep going, but maybe someone can try to fix it. Beth, will you try to find Cassie? Also want to say, can't tell Beth because I was going to say thank you to Beth. Beth and Carlin sort of single-handedly pushed out all of our information on live stream, did all of our social media outreach, and just a really heroic effort. So thank you so much for your support. Also, Tyler and Ryan here managing the live stream. Huge thank you to you guys. So just a couple of other quick thank yous. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Kirby. I'm the current president of the Arkansas Association for Behavior Analysis. A few other quick thank yous. Some local businesses who really made today possible. The conference venue was partially sponsored by Thrive. The NWA Center for Autism in Grace School hosted the workshop last night. That was no small thing, and it turned out great. Learning and Behavior Solutions and Hope for Autism sponsored our speaker baskets, which are adorable. The NWA Center for Autism in Grace School and ArkABA sponsored the student giveaways. So if you're a student, you can get a ticket, get put in a drawing for some really cool stuff. Okay. Couple of logistics here. We will have a restroom break just sort of halfway through Dr. Ramsay's talk. We are not doing CEUs for Dr. Ramsay's talk, so you won't need to worry about that, but when you come back from that, you'll sign in and out at the door so that you can get CEUs, and the live stream guys will listen for the embedded code words that they will be able to email to us. Please check out the posters that are in the hallway on breaks, and then we're going to have a brief business meeting after our last speaker of the day. On to the introduction. So Dr. Gordon Ramsay is our first speaker. He completed his PhD in electronics and electrical engineering at the University of Southampton. In England, he received his Master's of Philosophy from Cambridge University in speech and language processing after undergraduate studies in engineering. He's worked in France, Canada, and Belgium, as well as many other places, I think. He's held visiting positions at the University of Western Sydney, Australia, as well as in Ethiopia. Before beginning his position at Emory and Marcus Autism Center, he was an associate research scientist at the autism program at the Yale Child Studies Center, a fellow of the Saybrook College at Yale University, and a senior scientist at Hoskins Laboratories. At Marcus Autism Center, he directs the spoken language communication laboratory. He's assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Emory University in the School of Medicine, and he's a core faculty with the Center of Translational Social Neuroscience at Emory University. He's like, wow, okay. Huge credentials. So his research focuses on mathematical models of speech production and perception, which he's currently applying to developmental profiling of vocal behavior, spoken communication, and social interaction in infants at risk for autism. In collaboration with some other guys, Dr. Jones and Klein, his research helps to show how early emerging mechanisms of social engagement are potentially derailed in autism in the first year of life. This will eventually lead to evidence-based technologies for early detection and intervention to address the social communication deficit in autism. So I just can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to hearing you talk. Just one last note, and I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I did hear that Dr. Ramsay, if he likes you, might sing happy birthday to you in different languages, including, I don't know, maybe something from the Lord of the Rings. So I want you to know that I did have a birthday in April, and at any time today, yeah, I want to do that.
So I have a weird accent, and I tend to talk down a little bit. Is it working now?
It's working just a minute.
Okay, yeah. I didn't. No. Working yet? No. Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer, for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. This is my first time in Arkansas. I'm so happy to see all of you here. And I hope that this talk will be interesting to you and will perhaps teach you stuff, not only stuff that you may know a little bit about, but not a lot about, but also some new stuff that you certainly won't have seen before. I'm hoping the mic will work, because otherwise you at the back won't be able to hear me. If anyone can't hear me, you can just wave your hand at any point and I'll speak up while the microphone is still malfunctioning. Thank you also to the live stream participants. I can't see you. I hope you can hear me and see me. It's also a pleasure to have people tuning in from so far away. So my talk is about early vocal behavior and developmental pathways to spoken language in infants at risk of autism. This is quite a long talk. I have no financial or non-financial relationships with anything I'm presenting. I have no conflicts of interest. And we're funded by the National Institutes of Health and also by private foundations, the Marcus Foundation, the Whitehead Foundation, and the Georgia Research Alliance, without which none of which I'm going to show you will be possible. So I'm very grateful to them for all their support over the years. Oops. Oh, the clicker doesn't work. So the objectives of this talk are basically, I'd like you by the end of this talk to be able to understand the relationship between communication deficits and other core features of autism spectrum disorders. That's actually a very complicated and not fully understood relationship right now, and that's the main focus of my research program. I want you to know about the current state of knowledge concerning spoken language development in autism relative to typical development and why that's important. Is that working now? Suddenly I got louder. Yes, great. Okay, cool. We're on board. Okay. And then also in the last half of my talk, I'm going to talk about new experimental research paradigms for tracking the developmental unfolding of speech in typical development as well as in autism from infancy through early childhood. It's quite remarkable over the last 10 to 20 years how much more we can do in terms of early detection interventions through new technology than I as an engineer and with my weird background would ever have thought was possible. And so I hope I'll be able to communicate some of that excitement to you. And then finally, most importantly, I'm going to try to get you to consider how all of these paradigms and all the information I'm going to show you will lead not in the distant future, but in the very near future, I hope, to new clinical tools for assessment intervention that will help to change the lives of all of those individual children. Oops. This clicker is not working too well. So the talk is divided into all these different sections. It's quite a long talk, 3 hours. I don't think any of you will be able to last out that long, especially with my weird accent. So around about halfway through, we're going to take a 10-minute break. I will stay up here and you could ask me questions if you like, and we'll have 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. But feel free to leave the room at any point in time. I appreciate this is quite long. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the center I work, the Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta, which is a truly fantastic place to work. I've been there about 7 years now after coming down from Yale. And the reason for that is we have a very special approach to helping kids and helping kids with autism. And it really structures the way in which we do research in ways you won't find in an academic university environment. That's why it's really important to me. I'm going to review a little bit about autism spectrum disorder for those of you who haven't encountered all of that literature before, and to talk really about speech and language deficits within autism, which is the subject of my talk. In order to understand all of that, we're going to go right back to early infancy, and I'm going to spend quite a lot of time teaching you everything that we currently know, or I currently know about early vocal development in the first 3 years of life, and how that falls over in autism and why it falls over in autism. I'm going to present a very particular perspective on what my group currently thinks about the reasons behind the impact that autism has on early speech and language development in young kids. And we'll hopefully be able to put together a coherent picture of why autism has the effect it has on talking in those young kids. So that's basically the first half of the talk. And we'll take a break then. And then the last half of the talk, I'm really going to spend it talking a lot about research and new results, really trying to map out that process of early vocal development in kids with autism, and telling you a little bit about what we understand now that we didn't perhaps understand 10 years ago through our research, through our technology, in ways that provide very clear messages to us as researchers and also to the clinicians that we work with about what you should perhaps be thinking of doing to scaffold a child's development if they are at risk of autism. And we'll end with some conclusions and ways we're heading in the future, because the whole field is moving very rapidly right now, again, in ways that we didn't think were possible 10 years ago. And then I'll give you an opportunity at the end to ask me questions about anything that we didn't cover or anything you're particularly interested in, okay? I should have to start the timer, because otherwise I won't be able to tell how long I'm taking. Okay. Okay, so this is the Marcus Center where I work. We're a very special center. We're the largest center providing care for kids with autism in the Southeast. And we have a unique position between Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, which is one of the largest pediatric healthcare organizations in the nation, and Emory University School of Medicine, which is our academic home, which is a wonderful medical school. We have seen a growing number of patients over the years. The Marcus Center was started by Bernie Marcus, the founder of Home Depot, and he started in a trailer in the car park of the pediatrics department at Emory. But the need was so great that that wonderful man basically created the entire center through his philanthropy, specifically dedicated to helping kids with autism. And in 2016, last year, we saw more than 6,000 unique patients. And we have a combination of basic research, clinical care, and community outreach, which I'm going to talk about through a partnership between healthcare and university, really, which comes together in a very special way to make sure that everything we find out about autism is translated out into the community as rapidly as possible. Oops. We also have outreach centers across the state, so we can only see 6,000 kids in our building every year. That's not enough. There are 26,000 kids with diagnosis of autism in Georgia alone, and so it's very important to us that we also work out how to reach kids across the whole state. Some of the moms in my program drive up to 6 hours to participate in our research and our clinical practices. That's not acceptable, and we're working out how we can make that better for them. We have an enormous range of public and private partnerships, which is very important to us. This is just a list of a few of the people we work with. Oops, this clicker is really not working very well. And the bedrock of everything we do is that we are an autism center of excellence funded by NIH. And the most important thing for us is we have a tripartite kind of combination of clinical services, basic research, and teaching and outreach. And we strongly believe that you can only really attack a problem like autism in the community if you have these three things coming together in a very special way in partnership with our community. So when we came down from Yale, Yale was a very academic institution, as you can imagine, it's a bit of an ivory tower, and we tried very hard to take our research and translate it into practice, but it didn't work very well. And when we came down to Atlanta, the biggest thing we realized is that there's a way of doing business, a way of translating your research into clinical services and community practice that you can actually structure and approach systematically. And so in our center, we really believe right now that basic research has to be conceptualized from the outset. In terms of translation, we don't now think about how we might translate our research into practice down the road in 20 years. We don't design studies right now unless from the outset we know how they are going to be put into practice in the community. And that's really changed the way we do business. We didn't think like that before as academics, unfortunately, but we do now, and we have to. The second thing is that we strongly believe that clinical services have to be economically viable, evidence-based, and derived from the latest and best scientific research. Many of the treatment programs that you sometimes see in academic institutions cost a large amount of money. They cost a vast amount of money for each individual child. Sometimes they can cost about $60,000 or $70,000 to get one particular child to acquire a particular skill. That simply isn't viable when you have a state where 26,000 kids have autism and need access to services. And so now also we're looking at ways in which we can devise those clinical services so they're much more economical based on the results of our science. And most importantly, community involvement and ongoing input from families is essential. I don't carry out studies now unless I have a focus group with parents in my community to work out whether there is anything about what I'm doing or how that will translate into practice for their kids down the road. If there's anything they don't agree with about that, or insights they can provide that will make that more effective and more sustainable in the future. And we now don't believe that any of those issues can really be ignored or postponed. You have to put them all together from the outset, and that's basically the way we do business. So, this clicker's really not good at all. So we have about actually 14 different research cores now in the building, and I'm going to talk to you about one of those research cores at the bottom here, the Spoken Communication Lab that I developed. But everything I'm going to show you really is integrated with all of those other areas of research. We also have a whole load of clinical programs that have been there for a long time, going from severe behavior, where my colleague Nick Cole takes kids who are exhibiting aggression and self-injury, and he manages to reduce those behaviors to ways that make them less of a danger to their families and beyond. And also we have a wonderful community outreach program. Like I mentioned, we have so many kids in the state, there's no way that our clinicians can see all of those kids in person. So we have some wonderful telemedicine programs. And one of them is the Autism Navigator, run by my dear colleague Amy Weatherby down at Florida State University. And she's put together a wonderful online platform for educating pediatricians and parents about what autism looks like early in life, and providing training so that they are better able to spot red flags for autism early on and know really what to do about it. And that's all online, and basically people can access that and get training that perhaps would be very expensive to provide if they had to come into our center themselves. And she's now running a trial across 4 states, and she's seeing 36,000 kids. Okay, and the final thing, which really structures the whole of my talk, what is our kind of our approach, our philosophy behind looking at early detection intervention for a disorder like autism? So my colleague Warren Jones at Army Clinic years ago really had this idea that if you have a child who is showing atypical physical growth, that's picked up automatically because they go into a pediatrician's office and you measure their height and their weight and their head circumference. And the CDC and other organizations, the World Health Organization, put out charts, growth charts, where you can see how those kids are doing relative to an entire control group. And so it's perfectly normal for us that if you have a disorder of physical development, you catch that very early on by measuring those physical properties and relating those to normative databases. And so really what Warren and Army proposed years ago is really, why can't we do that for something like social engagement? Social engagement is something that develops in a child. All of those adaptive skills that kids acquire from birth onwards, those can be measured now. Can we measure those in ways that we can actually map out typical development in social engagement versus atypical development? And can we produce something like growth charts of social engagement through our research against which we can compare kids, for example, with autism or other neurodevelopmental disorders, so that we pick them up earliest on in the first months of life and really catch them before they even begin to go off course in ways that are going to derail their development later on. And that's really the approach that we've adopted. Why is that important? Well, autism is a developmental disorder. It unfolds over time. And just as physical growth unfolds over time, there's a trajectory of growth that you measure through these growth charts. So with autism, there is a developmental unfolding of the condition, a developmental unfolding of the derailment of social engagement that we can also quantify if we measure trajectories over time, not simply cross-sectional measurements. And that's a key theme of everything I'm going to talk about. Okay, and so why is that important? Well, one of the things I've learned from research in 10 years in autism, where I've been right now, when I first started working in autism, many of us did not believe it would be possible to detect it in the first year of life. We simply didn't know if there were signs of autism that early. And we also didn't necessarily believe that every one of those children could have their development changed for the better, because we felt that perhaps their autism was so profound and so deeply embedded in their development that perhaps we couldn't do anything about it. And I can tell you right now that all the research we've done over the past 10 years has completely changed our perspective on autism. Everyone in my center right now believes very strongly that we can detect autism in the earliest months of life using cool technology and cool math, some of which I'm going to show you. But we also believe very strongly that that disorder is malleable from the earliest months of life at a moment where the brain is still developing, is still able to be formed by social experience and the experiences that child gets in the environment through parents or caregivers or clinicians. And we now believe very strongly that we'll soon have a world where autism is no longer a disability or even a disorder, but simply a difference. And our goal in my center, through our research and our programs and the way in which we are translating research into clinical practice, is really to create a world where nobody can tell which of those kids has autism unless they want you to know, and also where autism really is just a difference of quirkiness, perhaps differences in certain areas, but also perhaps skills and advantages and opportunities for using the positive side of their autism in ways that will make their lives so much better than we see in some of those kids nowadays. So, moving rapidly on, if I can get the clicker to work. So I'll start by talking a bit about autism, okay? And our conceptualization of autism, sorry, this clicker is really very frustrating. Okay, so our conceptualization of autism has changed over time. So as of the DSM-5, we now think that autism is defined by two core areas of impairment: deficits in social communication and also restricted interest and repetitive behaviors, okay? We used to think it was three areas of deficit. We used to think it was social interaction, spoken communication, and restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. And since the DSM-4, we've basically lumped together social interaction and spoken communication because we feel they go together very naturally, okay? But those two other areas still are not factoring together in any of the assessments that we carry out, and so we've kept those separate. This is important because we still don't understand exactly why it is that those two core features of autism stay apart, why we can't mush them together into one thing called autism, for example, and we still don't understand all of the detail of those two areas of dysfunction. The other thing about autism, which all of you know about, is that in the press, it's been feted widely about the increasing prevalence over the years. So now the current figure is about 1 in 68 kids in the general population will develop autism. And so there's been an increase in apparent prevalence because we're catching those kids earlier, and we have better ways of identifying what autism is and differentiating it from what used to be called mental retardation or cognitive impairments, which we used to see much more of in those kids in the past. But I think what people don't focus on so much is the recurrence rate, which has been stable for a very long time. So if you have an older child with autism or a first-degree relative with autism, the rate is about 1 in 5, unfortunately. So that really hasn't changed a great deal, even though the 1 in 68 figure, where we're really detecting kids in the community, has really appeared to go up and up and up, okay? Like I mentioned, 26,000 kids in Georgia have a diagnosis of autism. There are about 40,000 adults with autism in Georgia with a diagnosis right now. So this is a huge problem. And various studies have estimated that if you have a child with autism who is not given proper treatment early on, the cost for every individual child to the healthcare system can be about 1.2 million. Over the course of that child's lifetime. Okay, so this is a huge problem, and it's important not only for families but also for people who bear the burden of all of that expense in the healthcare system. So one of the puzzles for me as a speech scientist about autism is even though autism is defined by those two core areas of symptomatology, autism is not defined by speech and language deficits. Okay, so autism is not a deficit in speech and language specifically in its definition, because we know that many of those kids with autism will go on to talk perfectly well by the time they get to adulthood, even though there may be differences about the way in which they talk. And yet, children with autism are almost universally delayed in acquiring spoken language. 1 in 4 of those kids will never learn to talk and remain non-verbal over their whole lifespan. Another 1 in 4, according to Parent Report, will suffer what we call an apparent regression in the second year of life, where they appear to begin to start to talk and then they lose that ability, which is usually accompanied by a process of social withdrawal when the core features of autism really begin to emerge and the kids may get a diagnosis. And that's a little bit controversial in the area of research, but I've put those figures up just to show you that it's really very puzzling why it is that autism, which is not defined by deficits in speech and language, why it does cause problems with speech and language. And also, more importantly, why is it that 2 in 4 of those kids, okay, do not have deficits in speech and language? What is it that protects them from the impact of autism on speech and language? So what is it about autism that causes a risk for speech and language deficits? And what is it that creates resilience against those deficits in the kids who have autism or who have a liability for autism but don't end up with those problems? The other reason this is important is at the moment, the best prognostic indicator of long-term outcome in kids with autism is language ability in early childhood, around about 3 to 5 years of age. If you have a child with autism who can talk by the time they're 3, you already know that child is going to do so much better by the time they get to adulthood. If you have a child who's minimally verbal, who's not talking at all by 3, we know those are the kids who are going to end up in our severe behavior unit if they don't get extreme therapy by the time they're adolescents or adults. So for all those reasons, it's really important that we understand why autism impacts speech and language, and also that we begin to do a better job of getting kids to talk, which is partly what my research program is trying to work on. Okay, so I'm going to play an example of an adult with autism so you can see the endpoint, okay? There are two highly high-functioning adults with autism here, who we have permission to show. The live stream, guys, the live stream does not have the movies in because we don't typically show videos or identifying information. We don't stream that over the web, but I hope you'll be able to hear the audio anyway. So I'd like you to watch this video, and just most of you who work with kids or adults with autism will immediately recognize features of autism there. What I'm going to ask you right now is to focus on their speech and language and think to yourself, what is different about their speech and language, okay, relative to typically developing adults or adults with other communication disorders. So if the guy at the back could hopefully try to start the movie for me. Can you start the movie, please?
Well, I'm only a genius. Yeah, I'll say, yeah. I was really considering a math major at Yale, and you're teaching me these things. So it's like maybe I'm fond of the professors. Actually, I wonder if I could get a professor. I wonder if I could get a professorship in Yale in that. Well, I'll stick with these guys. The whole thing is first you have to get through college, and then you can through grad school. Not always the easiest. Well, you know what, I didn't want to find out because, you know, 30 is 1709, because I went from 1709 to 1710, and about 30 and 20. So you would get the other factor, right? So that code would find so that somebody found the code book. But the thing is that I like that code is that if you did find a number that was in front of it here, right? Yeah, I wonder how long it would take to break that. That's new. Some probably had tables with prime numbers. When you think some. Okay, because hold up the number in the table and see what's prime or not, and if it wasn't prime, just take that number. I'm sure.
Okay, so there you go. So anybody, what do you notice that's different about their speech and language? Just shout out, anybody, put your hand up. Audience participation, please. Go ahead.
The one individual facing that he kept interrupting.
Yeah, so. Right, so normally there's a process of conversational turn-taking where you understand that you stop talking when someone else talks. And really, even though they're apparently having a conversation because they're talking at each other, to each other, they're really not connecting that much. And so really what you have here is two monologues happening in parallel. And from time to time, those monologues kind of touch in with each other, and you can see moments where there seems to be a connection. But even when the two of them are standing right face to face, you get the impression that the guy on the left is not actually looking at the guy on the right, okay? So yeah, and also the fact that their conversations are not really connecting in ways that the conversation do. They're kind of talking about two different subjects, and they're not really contextually appropriate, okay? So normally when you have a conversation, you arrange stuff so that the content really flows from one person to another. And that's really deficit in pragmatics, okay? The fact that those conversations, those speeches are not really contextually appropriate. They're not really showing really that interaction that you'd expect in a conversation. How about their speech, okay, their voice quality? What do you notice about that?
Or volume control.
Yep. Anything else?
Nasally.
Yep, so there's like a nasal quality to their voice, okay? The intonation is kind of really flat and monotone, okay? So like a nasal monotone property, especially with the guy on the left there. And so you notice that immediately. And so this is something about adults with autism that we don't understand. They have a very special voice quality, which you can if you've worked with adults with autism for a while, you can recognize that very quickly. And either it's monotone, a bit hypernasal, okay? The amplitude control, the modulation is not very well controlled. It isn't always that everything is flat and monotone and nasal like that. You can actually get hypermodulation. Some adults with autism actually don't control things properly, and things kind of get overmodulated, and kids may talk too loudly at you, and they just can't regulate that. So that regulation of voice properties is also something that we see quite characteristically. So those two areas, the pragmatic deficit and the prosodic deficit, those are things that are specific the ways in which autism impacts speech and language, even though, like I said, autism is not specifically a deficit of speech and language by itself. So even though it's not defined by deficits in speech and language, autism definitely has a very specific impact in those two areas of speech and language and communication, and that's been recognized since the earliest descriptions of the disorder by Kanner and Asperger, for example. So the pragmatic deficit is inability to share attention, interact contingently. That's going to be a theme that comes back again and again in my talk. Communicate effectively and relevantly with others. And again, this prosodic deficit, there are all these different properties I've listed there that are known to really affect the prosody of the voice, okay, what we call the prosody of the voice, those melodic, rhythmic, intonational properties. And yet, if you listen to the individual sound segments, okay, the individual sounds that make up words in speech, we call normally phonemes or gestures, there's no problem with those adults saying pa or ba or making syllables, for example. The actual phonetic structure, the phonological structure of their speech is otherwise unimpaired, okay? So autism is not a disorder of syntax, it's not a disorder of morphology, it's not a disorder of phonology, okay? And that's remarkable to me as a speech scientist, because many of those individual sound segments in speech require exquisitely fine motor control of the larynx and the tongue and the jaw and all those other articulators to produce, and yet that is not impaired, usually in autism, except in those kids who are totally nonverbal. So it's very strange for me as a speech scientist why something like autism should impact really only the prosody and the pragmatics and not all those other things that are very easily derailed, as we see in other communication disorders, okay? The other area we mentioned are restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. So we see a whole load of special interests in those kids. I have a very good friend with autism whose special interest is fans. He knows everything about fans, okay? We had a kid who really loved vacuum cleaners. He could tell you everything about vacuum cleaners, okay? So there's restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, those stereotypies, okay? The hand flapping that you see in many of those kids doesn't actually begin as hand flapping. It begins as atypical posturing of the limbs really in the first year of life, that then emerges into this atypical rhythmic behavior, okay, which may eventually be self-injurious. And then one thing that's been added in the DSM-5, which was a huge argument between the community of parents and kids with autism and research scientists, is atypical sensitivity. So if you talk to any individuals with autism, they will tell you that quite often there is hyper or hyposensitivity to sensory stimuli in the environment. And for many years, we were told as researchers that this was due to, hypersensitivity of the ear or the touch system. And we tested for that, but we didn't find that. And so visual acuity, auditory acuity in children and adults with autism is comparable to typical development. Kids with autism don't have bionic ears, for example. The peripheral systems are working pretty much the same, but there is an inability to modulate or inhibit some of that sensory input centrally according to context. And so now we accept that, yes, of course, we've known all the time that there is this hyper and hypersensitivity, but the explanation that we argued about over the years really has changed a bit. And so and that's something we try to educate parents about as well. It's not the fact that your kid has, needs like an optometry exam or an auditory test because their ears are hypersensitive. It's really the inability to modulate that input according to your expectations about what's happening in the world, the inability to predict what's coming next, which goes along with those restricted interest and repetitive behaviors, because one way you can think about that is really insistence on sameness is an inability to deal or to predict with what's going to come next based on your experience of the world, okay? And this has impact in speech as well, but we're not going to talk about that today. Okay, so there we go. So that's a brief overview of some aspects of autism. Come on. Okay, if you could just play the movie at the back, please. Hello? Movie, please.
He's already, from his perspective, done inventory of toys and done this 3 times, so we won't say that. So he's kind of
His absence of gaze, the pacing round and round, and then touching the wall again and again. Okay, that's enough. Thanks. Can you stop that, please? Okay, the other thing which is important, so I mentioned those 2 core features and what we currently think about how we define them in DSM-5. The other thing which is really important in autism by the time you get to adolescence is that there are many comorbidities with autism. So for example, a long time ago, back in the 70s and 60s, almost all the adults with autism we saw had severe cognitive impairments. And Army, my boss, will tell you that when he was beginning as a graduate student, he really thought that, he really thought that cognitive impairments went along with autism, okay? And now we don't believe that because we see so many fewer of those kids now with severe cognitive impairments because we're catching them earlier and we're providing them with earlier intervention. In the same way, children with autism often suffer from dietary and gastrointestinal disorders, which may be related to selective food intake, again, that insistence on sameness, which is a core feature of the condition. And they have disruptions of other things that we don't really understand. But all of these comorbidities are not part of the core features of autism in the same way that speech and language deficits, in a way, could be thought of as a comorbidity now because they're not core defining features. And yet that's what happens if autism is not caught early enough and if you don't intervene early enough. The reason I'm mentioning this is because many of those things are going away over time as we catch those kids earlier and we intervene earlier. And really the message of hope is that now, as we're beginning to do research on autism in the first 3 years of life, we're seeing really the precursor of what we're calling autism in the clinic at the moment of diagnosis. And we're seeing that none of these things really is there yet, okay? And all of these things really crystallize over time. And if you see autism back in the first years of life, it looks very different. And many of those things are very much vestigial. They're still open to treatment and intervention. And you can actually make most of those things go away if you intervene early enough, which is, again, the message of hope that we have for our community. So, Bluetooth, oops, I'll get there eventually. Okay, another thing which is important, which we often argue about with some of our colleagues in other fields, especially genetics, for example, autism is a spectrum of disorders. It's likely to involve multiple mechanisms and pathways of dysfunction. I don't believe there is one single thing about autism that causes speech and language deficits. Speech and language is an enormously complicated thing that has to be scaffolded developmentally through multiple converging pathways of development. There are many things involved in that. And most of those, as we'll see, are impacted by social interaction and social engagement in the first years of life. And so autism really, because social engagement is so important to young children, that's really why it ripples out in all these different areas of behavior. It's specific, not general, okay? So like I said, autism is not just any old speech and language deficit comorbid with autism. It's specifically about pragmatics and prosody, okay? When we talk to colleagues in genetics, they quite often try to convince us that autism is really just one extreme end of typical development along some undefined scale. I don't believe that. When you see kids with autism or adults with autism, autism is a recognizable syndrome. It has very specific features to it. It's not just any old impairment or cognitive impairment, okay? And that's really why research is so important, because we're trying to work out what is specific to autism versus what is really just a consequence of autism that could arise through other pathways if you impacted a child early on, okay? So kids with deafness, okay, congenital deafness, they have trouble learning to talk quite often. That's not the same trouble that a kid with autism has. The kids with deafness don't have impairments in social interaction. The kids with autism do from the earliest months of life. And those two differences have very different effects upon pathways to speech and language. Okay, and again, to come back, I'm going to harp on about this again and again throughout this talk. Autism is a developmental disorder, okay? It's defined by the unfolding of the condition over time, and you can only understand it if you monitor the development of a child over time, okay? It's all about the trajectory, it's all about the roller coaster, it's all about the ride, it's not about the roller coaster, okay? If you can't see where that child came from and where they're going, you're not going to understand that trajectory, and the trajectory itself, the process of unfolding, is what autism is about, okay? So we've talked about autism, okay, and I've given you a little overview of many of the core features and problems in defining it and working with it. And the question for our research is, how do you objectively define, measure, detect, and alter the derailment of social development that we see in disorders like autism, okay? So if we have that conceptualization, which is kind of wishy-washy and vague in many ways, it's just words, okay? How do we take those words, those definitions, and actually make them concrete so we can actually measure and alter the development of each individual child at risk of autism because of their genetic liability? So in order to work on that, I'm going to spend about an hour now talking about the development of communication and speech and language in typical development. And I'm also going to show you what we know about how that unfolds how that unfolds and how that is derailed and different in autism. And this is really important because I hope you'll appreciate by the end of this talk how much we know about the way in which speech and language develop from the earliest vocal behaviors over that first 3 years of life, and also how specific and how developmentally timed those derailments are in autism. And I'm going to try and present a perspective where we bring all of this information together so that you will understand how typically developing kids learn to speak over the first 3 years of life, the processes they go through, and at what moments and why those processes are derailed by autism. And we're going to try to put together into a picture where you see how the social impairment in autism, which is one of the core defining features of the syndrome, how that actually results in speech and language deficits in ways that provide us with messages about how we should measure it and how we should intervene, okay? So we'll begin with communication, okay? Again, speech, language, and communication, those are three different things. I'm not going to talk very much about language today. I'm going to focus on speech and communication. So since the 60s and 70s, based on a guy called Austin, who wrote a wonderful book, How to Do Things with Words, and there's been a whole way of thinking about how children pass through different stages of communication. And these fancy words here, which I personally don't like because they kind of get in the way of the actual content, it's now thought that really kids go through three different stages as they learn to communicate. There's what's called a perlocutionary stage in the first half year of life or so, where kids, when they're born, they can't control their bodies properly. They don't have full volitional control over everything they're doing. Many of the things they do are simply reflexive or involuntary. Babies cry because they're hungry or distressed, okay? They don't decide to cry in the first months of life because the cortical networks that control that crying volitionally aren't yet in place, okay? But babies, from the first moments of life, they cry, okay? We know that. And those reflexive acts that happen by the infant, okay, are treated by caregivers as if they actually have intention before they have intention. So when if you watch a baby, okay, in a crib, every emotion of the world will pass over the face of that baby as the baby randomly pulls on its muscles, okay? And that doesn't mean anything. The baby isn't really smiling at 1 month, but some of the things babies do with their muscles resemble a smile. But you, as a caregiver or an adult, are intuitively drawn to interpret those random movements as an actual volitional smile, even before that intent is really there, okay? So in this earlier stage, this perlocutionary stage, babies do things without really having intentions, and yet they're treated by caregivers as if they have communicative intentions. The second stage, after babies begin to learn to control their bodies and do things in the world, is called the illocutionary stage. And this is really the point at which babies begin to express their intentions through vocalization and gesture. They realize that if you make sounds or you do movements, okay, you can get mom or dad to do things for you, okay? And you realize that things that you do in the world have consequences in the world, and you can begin to make the world do things for you, okay? But this is not yet speech and language, and those gestures and vocalizations are very much directly related to the things that they're referring to. So babies will look at objects, okay, or they'll touch things directly, but they don't yet say, oh, I'd like a glass of milk, okay? They don't yet have the symbolic reference that really associates arbitrary sound sequences with things in the world or actions in the world. And that comes in the last stage, the locutionary stage, which begins with first words and the onset of language, where babies begin to realize that they can have symbols that refer to other things, even though the sign and the symbol are not directly the same thing. Okay, and this is the moment at which babies realize that they can make words, which are just arbitrary sequences of sounds, and yet those sounds will have symbolic reference, and other people will recognize those signs as symbols, and hopefully begin to use those linguistically and communicatively. Okay. So those are the three stages that babies go through by the time they reach the second year of age. And in autism, we don't see that, okay? So in autism, infants with autism frequently don't get beyond that second illocutionary stage. They quite often have problems with symbol use, okay, in infancy. So the thing that's difficult for infants with autism is to make that transition from realizing that actions and sounds actually act as symbols and can have indirect reference for other things, okay? So one example of this is what's called hand over hand. That one very strong red flag for autism at the end of the first year of life. If you see a child with autism, an infant with autism, in the clinic, playing with a toy, or they have like a little tube of bubble liquid they want to open and they can't open it, okay? Typically, the developing child will look at mom and look at the bubble container, or look at mom and look at the toy if they can't reach it, and they'll try to get mom to do something with the toy, and they'll do that either by making sounds or by gesturing to mom or pointing, or basically indirectly getting mom to do something. What we see with infants who go on to develop autism is quite often they will simply not even look at mom, but simply take mom's hand and use it. They know that a hand opens a tin or a container, and they will simply take the hand and try to use it as a tool to open the container, because that's kind of what they got about hands, okay? There's much less pre-verbal communication. Like I said, lack of joint attention and gaze following, okay? Kids really are drawn to follow other people's gaze. They're constantly trying to interpret what other people are doing, and through this process of joint attention, and that also falls over very early on in kids with autism. Many of those kids show limited vocal or verbal imitation, okay? Though sometimes later that becomes overused and it becomes something called echolalia, okay? So kids, and typically developing kids, tend to imitate a lot, okay? They see mom doing something, they try to do what mom is doing. If mom says something, they try to say something back. That process of imitation is a period, a stage of development that kids go through typically, and that quite often falls over in autism. And then limited response to speech. Quite often kids with autism won't respond to their name. That's another thing that mom has noticed very early on, and they don't really respond to speech versus other sounds. That preferential attention to speech versus other sounds in the environment also is something that doesn't seem to be there in autism. I'm going to talk about that washing out, that lack of discrimination between socially relevant stimuli and physical stimuli in the world. That's going to be something we talk about as well, okay? And then receptive and expressive language impairments, which are related to the speech and language deficit we talked about. Now, if we look at all of those together, most of those really can be shown to be relevant to global deficits in social engagement. All of those things are really relevant to the process by which babies or infants and children interact with the world, okay? So again, this is linked back to that social engagement problem with autism. Oops. There's a nice paper by Rhiannon Loyster basically summarizing all of that, and she basically looked at all of these issues of early communication in autism, and she looked at how they predict language development, okay? So all of those things we just mentioned, if you're doing those things, they tend to predict concurrent or future language development, okay? And they're good signs that language is on its way to happening, and if that doesn't happen, which is quite often the case in autism, that really is a bad thing that basically tends to predict lower language ability. And in general, as a result of this whole survey, okay, which I'm not going to read out, and you can see it there on the screen, her basic conclusion was that early behavioral measures of social engagement generally predict later language outcome in autism. So something about early social engagement, early social interaction is scaffolding speech and language, and the more you have social engagement, a lack of social impairment early on, the better you're going to do down the road. And so because autism is a deficit in social interaction, that's partly why it tends to result in impairment in communication specifically. So more interesting to me as a speech scientist is really speech and vocal development. And this is where we know a huge amount and we know a lot of detail about how kids actually begin to learn to control their voices in ways that lead on to speech and language. So I'm going to go through a whole summary of everything we know about speech and vocal development now, and present to you a coherent, I hope, framework basically about what we think right now about how speech and language develops in typical development and all the different ways in which it falls over in autism. Okay, so if you work in the area of speech research, people have violent arguments about speech perception and production in adulthood. There are all kinds of competing camps about what different theoretical perspectives you could have on the way adult brains speak. Remarkably, when you go back to childhood, for about 30 or 40 years now, there's been a remarkable confluence, a convergence of opinion about the way in which children learn to produce spoken language. And so at the moment, since the work of Kim Oller, Rachel Stark, and a few other people, Carol Stoll-Gammon, back in the 70s and 80s, everybody pretty much agrees that kids really pass through 5 stages of speech development on the path to spoken language. And so I've listed them out there. And so from the first 2 months of life, we go through what's called a reflexive or endogenous responding phase, where kids really are producing spontaneous vegetative or distress sounds. But like I said before, they can't really control their bodies properly yet. Those sounds are not really under volitional control. The first thing that happens around about 6 to 16 weeks is what's called phonatory control. Phonation is the process of actually getting your vocal folds to vibrate and produce the voice, okay? And interestingly enough, the larynx, the voice box, the vocal folds are the things that kids learn to produce first, okay? They begin to produce intonational contrasts, intonational patterns. They control their respiration, okay? And that prosody, those prosodic aspects of language, which for adults are they're kind of related to extralinguistic or emotional aspects of speech. Remarkably, those are actually what kids get first, okay? So the prosody of the voice, phonatory control, is what comes out first, that second stage. And at this point, because of the way the vocal tract grows, the tongue is still very large in the mouth, okay? There's not a lot of space in there, and so kids can't really move their tongues around very much. In the next stage, vocal expansion from 4 to 8 months, the vocal tract is growing very rapidly. There's more space to move the tongue around, and this is the point at which kids begin to learn to control their jaw and their tongues. They move those articulators around, those oral articulators around in ways that produce different opening and closing movements, and this is where you begin to get things like vowels and the precursors of what later become consonants and vowels begin to emerge. And we don't call them consonants and vowels at this age, we call them closants and vocants, because they're basically simply opening and closing movements of the vocal tract. The child doesn't really understand what a consonant or a vowel is, but this is the point at which adults start to hear consonants and vowels in the child's speech. And like I said, the caregiver and adults around the child are always over-interpreting the skills of the child before they actually acquire them. And that's actually very important, because that is what drives the child along the path to spoken language. Your mom and your dad always think you're a little genius, and they always think that you're capable of doing things in the world before you actually are. And guess what? That process of over-attributing your abilities, your skill set, before you actually have that skill set is actually part of the stimulus, the drive that pulls you along that progression to adaptive behaviors, okay? And so at this point, adults start to hear what they think of vowels, squeals, glides, precursors of consonants, vowels in the child's speech. But it's not till the next stage, which is critically important for speech and language, called canonical babbling, which happens towards the second half of the first year of life, that children actually begin to put sounds together, okay? Canonical babbling is a very special thing that only happens in humans. It doesn't happen in other species, and no child really will learn to speak without going through this process of babbling. And babbling is not just making any old sound, it's a specific technical term that means you're producing closants and vocants, consonants and vowels, or the precursors of those consonants and vowels in sequence to do things like ba ba ba, da da da, nya nya nya. And there's a specific stage of speech development where kids suddenly are driven to babble, and once they start doing it, they'll just do it all the time, and they'll do it constantly, and it happens over a period of about 2 to 3 weeks where kids suddenly start to be driven to babble. We don't understand why. They're biologically canalized to babble, and they'll start doing ba ba ba, da da da, ga ga ga, okay? And those consonants and vowels produced in sequence at this stage are the same consonant and the same vowel. So it's ba ba, okay, B-A, okay, or da da. And what happens after that is what's called variegated babbling, where they learn to mix and match things, and they might say gee-goo or whatever, okay? So this stage, canonical babbling, is where you begin to achieve the sequencing of sounds, okay, where you learn to put sounds together in sequence, and that's where syllables emerge, okay? And syllables are the building blocks from which you get first words, which is what happens next, okay? In this process called advanced forms. Around about 12 months of age, kids begin to produce first words, and then they're on the rocket ship to language, and language starts to take off and they acquire symbolic function, okay? So that's a brief overview of what kids go through in the first 2 years of life, okay, from not being able to control their vocal tracts at all, from simply crying reflexively, producing distress sounds, all the way through to babbling, nya, 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 ba, 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 okay, and then finally producing first words and then having that vocabulary expansion, okay? Like I said, there's remarkably little disagreement about the fact that this happens. What we don't know right now is what causes the transition between each of those stages, okay? And the extent to which each of those stages, that developmental progression through the first 2 years of life, is really impacted by specific features that are inherent in autism relative to other disorders, okay? So I'm going to go through each of those stages in turn now. And we're going to talk about in more detail about what we expect to see in typical development, and then also what we would expect to see in kids at risk of autism, okay? And the basic theme over the last 20 to 30 years, and really only in the last 10 years, we realized through research that actually all of those stages are critically mediated by social interaction with caregivers, okay? And so I'm going to describe some experimental results that basically show that each of those stages really, and especially the process of babbling, is critically mediated by the process of contingent responding between the caregiver and the child, and that is one theory, one hypothesis about why autism has such a bad impact on speech and language early on. This is not working. Come on. Okay, there we go. Okay, where does it begin? Well, I went back to birth, and actually speech and language begin to form in the brain of the child before birth. And remarkably, even though kids can't see when they're born, okay, and as a child emerges into the world, they can't see properly, they really have trouble with their visual systems. The visual system is not intact yet, but the auditory system, remarkably, is fully developed around about 22 weeks gestation, and by the third trimester, babies in the womb, fetuses in the womb, begin to hear the world around them, and they start to hear muffled sounds from the outside world. And remarkably, through a whole process of research, we've conducted experiments that show that by 35 weeks gestation, fetuses begin to prefer speech versus other sounds. They begin to prefer to listen to mom's voice versus other people's voices, and they specifically are attracted to the intonation of mom's voice, okay? And we do that by measuring the baby's heart rate, and there's a thing called the cardiac orienting response, which is still intact after birth, where if I startle you and I shout really loudly into my microphone, okay, your heart rate will go up. Every one of you had a little cardiac acceleration when I did that, okay? And that's true in kids as well. If you're paying attention to something, okay, and your heart rate will actually slightly go down. There's a heart rate deceleration that is accompanied by that process of that cognitive process. And that actually you can measure with ultrasound in the womb. And we've shown through many of these studies that actually those mechanisms of preferential orientation to speech, to mom, and to mom's intonation really begin before birth, okay? And that's why the intonation? Well, the intonation really, that low frequency component of the voice is the only thing that really makes its way through the abdominal tissue. All of those higher frequency components, okay, of mom's voice don't really get into the womb, okay? So the baby in the womb is really going, okay? Imagine mom's intonation, okay? That's really what the baby's hearing, and the baby's brain is able to actually take in those sounds and start to develop preferential orienting to those sounds. Why is that important? Like I said, when babies are born, they can't see properly, okay? The world is full of blobs. The world is full of talking blobs, and one of those talking blobs is the talking blob called mom, okay? And those preferential orienting mechanisms that are required in the womb are critical in really allowing babies, newborn babies, to turn towards caregivers who are the source of so many things for them in the world: food, nourishment, safety, shelter, okay? Babies use those preferential orienting mechanisms, which are there from the point of birth and even before birth, to start turning towards sources of relevant and important information in the world. If a baby can't do that, they're going to be in trouble because they're not going to be able to turn towards a source of speech or the thing that's the talking face that's providing all of that language input. If babies aren't driven to turn towards talking faces innately and intuitively, they're going to have trouble working out what speech actually is. And so really, these preferential orienting mechanisms are present from the moment of birth. They begin in the womb, and they're critically important for scaffolding the beginnings of attention to speech and language. So we talked a little bit about this already, okay? And when infants are born, they don't really have fully developed cortical networks. There is a subcortical system in the brainstem that controls the movements of their body, but those cortical networks, those connections between different brain regions, are not really fully formed, and they start to come online around about 2 months of age. So there's a very important period that we're really very interested in right now in autism, and that transition from subcortical to cortical control that happens around 2 months is a very critical, pivotal transition in the life of a child. And before that transition happens, really most of the sounds that babies make, like I said, are either reflexive, like fussing or crying, and they're driven perhaps by distress or hunger or things in the autonomic system, or they're vegetative, where basically babies just randomly, they pull on the muscles of their body because that's what their subcortical system is doing. And if you pull on your vocal tract in different ways, once in a while you'll produce something like a raspberry, like, okay, or you'll go, okay, or you'll create like a grunt, okay? But those are really just random consequences of motor actions in the body. They're not things the baby is actively controlling, okay? And again, like I said before, at this point, babies randomly contract their facial muscles, okay? And there's a thing called social smiling that emerges around 2 months of age, where babies just randomly make their faces change in different ways. They yawn, they do all kinds of things. And some of those look like adult expressions, and moms really love to attribute intention and active engagement or reciprocal engagement to those random facial muscles in ways that later teach the baby, yes, this is a smile, and a smile is different from other facial movements, and the smile will get something from mom that you don't get by randomly pulling on your muscles in other ways, okay? The main thing that happens during this period is the lungs grow very rapidly and babies begin to control their breathing. That's important because one of the limitations on early vocalizations in babies is their lung capacity. When the baby cries, the duration of the cry is basically how much air you can hold in your lungs. And so you can actually measure respiratory capacity in babies by looking at how long their cries are and seeing how their cries can get longer and longer and longer, and then eventually be controlled into whole sentences by the time they're 2 years of age. So that breathing, which we don't often think about in terms of the physiological substrate of speech, has to be there at this point. What does autism look like? Actually, let's play the sound there. Can you play the sound file? Could you play the sound file for me? It's the icon on the left, yeah. You know what a cry sounds like, but that's just a discrimination from everything we're going to hear later, okay? So, what do you notice about that? There are no oral articulations. There's no real movement of the tongue there. The baby just opens its mouth. Okay, the only thing that's really creating the sound are the vocal folds, okay? And the baby is not really creating a fully fledged intonation contour. They're simply breathing out. If you breathe out and you pull your vocal folds together, you'll get okay? But there's no oral articulation there at this point, okay? At this point, we know from a lot of research and parent anecdotes as well that kids with autism display atypical patterns of crying and distress, okay? And a few studies have shown that high-risk infants produce fewer prototypical cry patterns by the time of 6 months of age, as rated by adult observers, okay? So the meaning of those cries to adults and caregivers is different. They also tend to produce higher pitch cries than controls. If you're in a state of hypertension, which is the case with many neurodevelopmental disorders, that tends to raise the pitch of the voice, okay? And so it's unsurprising that something like autism, where babies quite often have a rigidity even from birth. If you pick up a baby with autism, they're very stiff. They don't accommodate the body in the same way that typically developing babies do. They tend to be very stiff, and there's a process of hypertension we see in those kids. And we know that in general, there are 4 or 5 different types of cry, okay, each of which has a specific context in typical development. And we know that many of those cry types are off in autism. And we also know that many of the acoustic features that define those different cry types, okay, are related to arousal regulation and neurological integrity. And this is not specific to autism, and so we know that many neurological impairments that begin congenitally or just after birth will impact cry patterns. And atypical cry is one of the things you can use as signs of a problem with the neurological development of a child. But there's only one disorder, the Cri-du-chat syndrome, which is specifically defined by cry properties. And so cry properties, even though they accompany autism, they're not specific to autism, and they're not necessarily diagnostic for autism, okay? But we do see that in our babies, and we'll talk about that as well, okay? What I'll talk about later on is the extent to which cry becomes social cry, okay? And the extent to which one thing which is specific to autism is the meaning of crying and the way in which cry is used, okay? And we can talk about that through our research, okay? Second stage, phonatory control, okay? As the breathing begins, as the lungs increase in capacity and they begin to control their breathing, they can phonate, they can make their vocal folds vibrate for longer, and that gives them longer time over which they can begin to develop control over the tension of their voice, and they start to play around with their vocal fold tension, and they realize that you can modulate intonation patterns, okay? And then you can start to use that to produce volitional non-cry sounds, or sounds that are deliberate, where you can hear that the baby is playing with their body, with their vocal tract, to make different sound types, and they explore the range of sounds that babies can make with their own vocal tracts, okay? So can we have the sound file there, please? And so that's longer than that little that I showed you before, okay? And you've got ingressive sound, we've got the infant breathing in, breathing out, okay, and doing things to make different sounds. And this is the point at which things like grunting, cooing, and chuckling emerge, and so many moms will tell you that yes, your baby is starting to laugh and chuckle, okay, at this point. And also, as babies play around, they realize that you can open and close your vocal tract with your tongue and your jaw, and you can start to make things that are sustained, like ah or ee, okay? Or you can close off the vocal tracts entirely and go ga or gu, 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 okay? And the reason this is called the cooing stage is that the tongue is still very big in the baby's mouth, and most of the closures that you can make with a baby tongue happen at the back of the throat, and that's where k and g is really made in adulthood. And so adults hear this as cooing or gooing because adults are hearing velar consonants at the back of the throat, but actually that's just a physiological property of the baby's vocal tract. Babies can't go duh at this point because they can't position their tongue properly behind the teeth, okay? And at this stage, we know that pre-verbal vocalizations of infants with ASD at this stage tend to have an unusual tone to them, okay? So one of the first moms in my research study, I was really enrolling her newborn baby, and she said, I wish you'd listen to my older child, because he sounded like a dolphin around about 4 or 5 months, okay? And so she basically said that, he was making high-pitched, he was making very unusual squealing sounds. And if you listen to many of those high-risk babies, even the ones who don't actually go on to develop full-blown autism, a lot of them do show atypical sound structures here that you don't hear often in typical development. So something like autism, even by this period here, of phonatory control, is starting to impact the way in which babies are making sounds with their vocal tracts in ways that sound different to adults. And many of our moms tell us that they heard something was different in their child, even at the beginning of that first year of life, when we give a diagnosis at 2 years of age. Okay. Vocal plane expansion, okay? Once the infants learn to control their vocal tract, they control the intonational properties with the larynx, okay? They start to be able to control the tongue and the jaw and actually make deliberate closures at different points along the vocal tract. And this is where you start to hear things that really sound vowel-like, ah, ee, okay? And this is also the point at which infants noticeably begin to produce more speech-like sounds when they're stimulated by speech, eye contact, and facial expressions by caregivers. So at this stage, babies are making lots of sounds. Many of those sounds are just babies exploring the way in which they can make sound, okay? But some of those sounds are more speech-like than others. And at this stage, the caregiver becomes critical because the babies will start to produce more speech-like sounds when they hear speech-like sounds from caregivers. And so social interaction with caregivers really is structuring the choice of sounds that babies begin to make and really beginning to establish the repertoire of speech-like sounds that they need to draw on when they start to produce actual speech and consonants and vowels and syllables later on. And at this point also, caregivers are driven to do that by stimulation from the infants themselves. So as the infant responds to the caregiver will also respond more to the infant, okay? So this contingency, this contingent interaction between infant and caregiver at this particular point is what starts to draw all of those random sounds produced by baby vocal tracts towards speech-like sounds rather than just any old arbitrary sound you can make with your vocal tract, okay? As an adult, I don't typically tend to make raspberries very often, okay? I think about 3 months ago I made one deliberately to a colleague, but at this point, babies make lots of raspberries. How is it that they choose not to make raspberries anymore and they choose to go ah and ba, okay? The reason is that adults teach them this through contingent interaction in the first year of life. And at this stage, I'm going to show you some research that shows that at this stage, at the end of the first year of life, babies with autism are already failing to preferentially attend to faces and voices. They're not driven to prefer to look at a talking face versus, for example, a light switch or an object in the environment, okay? And if you don't have this preferential orienting to talking faces, which typically developing babies absolutely do, even from the earliest months of life, and if you're not stimulated by contingent interaction, if you don't really care about the response of the caregiver or what the caregiver is doing in response to you, you're not going to start to have your vocal productions converge towards speech-like sounds, okay? So another reason why autism is also going to have an impact at this stage of development. Oops. Okay, oh, we didn't play the sound there, sorry. Can you play the sound? Yep.
I know. I know. There's more?
So if you listen to that, okay, the baby hasn't got full speech, but the baby is already making oral articulations, creating sounds that to us sound a little bit like vowels. Some of them are almost consonant-like, okay? And what is the mom doing? She's creating a proto-conversation around those baby's utterances, okay? And so even at this stage where the baby is not capable of a full conversation, the baby doesn't have full speech-like sounds, the caregiver is interacting with the baby as if they were creating a conversation. What I said before, moms love to over-attribute intention to their babies, okay? She's creating a proto-conversation by timing her utterances with respect to the babies, and she's also promoting and stimulating the productions of the baby himself. Now, when she did that, okay, she did a very special thing, which technically is called infant-directed speech and colloquially is called motherese, okay? Adults talk differently when they talk to babies, okay? When I talk to a baby, I talk like this, and I make these swoopy sounds, and I don't really care about the crazy things I'm saying, because I know that you can't understand what I'm saying, and oh, you don't know what I'm saying yet, but I don't care, I'm gonna do this anyway, okay? Now, I don't do this to you, because you would think this is totally nuts, okay? And 2-year-olds don't like this either, they'll walk away if you try doing this to them. Okay, that's called baby talk, okay? And what characterizes it is long, drawn-out, swoopy intonations, okay, and modulation of those prosodic properties. And guess what? Moms tend to do baby talk in the first months of life, right? So that's what I would do if I were talking to like a 2 or 3-month-old. But when the babies start, so that's one kind of infant-directed speech, baby talk. As infants begin to get to the stage we just listened to and they produce consonants and vowels and syllables, the moms change their baby talk and they start to over-articulate the mouth sounds. Go, oh, do you want milk? Would you like to see daddy or mommy? Because they start to realize that babies are really eager for consonants and vowels and speech sounds in the world, okay? They're not necessarily looking for just stimulation from those intonational properties, okay? And so there is a developmental progression in the infant that we've seen moving through those 5 stages of speech development, but there's also a developmental progression in the caregiver where the caregiver changes the nature of their vocal responding to stimulate babies to move along those stages of development, okay? So why does baby talk use the intonation? Why am I modulating my intonation in ways I don't do in adulthood? Because as we saw, the intonation of mom's voice is what the baby experiences in the womb. It's the thing that the baby picks up on most when they emerge into the world. So it's perfectly natural that moms know that intuitively through millions of years of evolution. They know that the thing that will attract baby's attention just after birth is the intonation of their voice, okay? And babies in the first months of life don't really care about anything about speech as a sound apart from really the intonational properties, because they don't know about consonants and vowels, or even that they can use their vocal tracts to produce those kinds of sounds, okay? By the time they get to 9 to 12 months and they're beginning to babble, okay, they've discovered closants and vocants and proto-syllables and proto-conversations, and so the mothers begin to scaffold that by hyper-articulating those oral articulations in ways that will promote the emergence of differentiated consonant sounds, okay, in ways that will eventually lead into a full phonological inventory for that language, okay? And remarkably, all the languages of the world appear to have motherese, okay? There are different types of motherese sometimes, there are cultural differences, but motherese or parentese is something that all adults tend to engage in naturally and intuitively. And if you put a baby in front of an adult, chances are they'll begin to speak to that baby in ways that are developmentally appropriate for that baby, okay? And so if I stick in front of you a picture of a 2-year-old, you will speak differently than you would to an adult, and you'll also speak differently to that 2-year-old than you would to a 1-month-old baby, okay? The other thing which is really important, there's a whole theory of speech and language acquisition called prosodic bootstrapping. And the idea is that somehow the prosody of the voice is what babies pick up on first, okay? And the prosody is really what is the anchor that babies really begin to hook speech and language onto. They begin to hear those intonational phrases. If I talk for a long time, I will eventually run out of breath, okay? And from the way the physics of sound production in the vocal tract, as I run out of breath, okay, the intonation contour will go down at the end. It's just the way in which sound production works. And you can use that to identify points at which phrase boundaries happen in speech. And so if you're not sensitive to prosody, if you can't pick up on those intonational contrasts, and you said there was a prosodic deficit in autism, okay, that's going to stop you really taking advantage of this prosodic bootstrapping as the earliest hook on which you begin to hang language. Okay, so another reason why autism may be different. I have competition from the. It's outside actually. It's a car.
Oh,
yeah.
A car. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's fine. I'll just keep talking louder. Okay, this is the really crucial bit, okay? This is canonical babbling, okay? Again, this technical term. It's very important you realize babbling is not just any old sound that babies produce, okay? Sometimes you see in the literature people talking about babbling or jabbering. Oh, my baby was babbling. No, it's not just any old sound. It's the fact your baby is going ba 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 ba, or da 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 da, or nya 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 nya, okay? Now, some of those sounds that babies use in babbling aren't always the same as adult sounds. So nya nya nya, I don't say nya nya nya. There are no words that go nya 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 in English, okay? And yet nya 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 is something that babies you'll quite often hear making, okay? And again, this is the point at which vocants and closants, opening and closing movements of the vocal tract, begin to become consonants and vowels that adults hear as consonants and vowels. And the crucial thing here, what is it that makes those syllables different from the earlier sounds babies are making? It's really sequential control. This is the way at which the point in development at which babies begin to be able to produce sequences of actions, exquisitely timed sequences of actions where they put actions together, actions of the vocal tract, actions of their limbs together in things that make meaningful sequences. Okay, so sequencing is really the thing that's critical here. And this is where we begin to hear syllables, okay? And this is the point at which canonical babbling, which is the same closant and vocant in sequence, ba ba ba, da da da, becomes variegated babbling, di do, ga gi, different sounds, ga do, okay, different sounds mixed and matched. And that combinatorial explosion, the ability to sequence sounds and to sequence different sounds that you choose in sequence, is what forms the clay from which babies begin to mold words, okay, first words, which happens next, okay? And we know from a whole load of studies, probably the biggest area of research used to be this emergence of babbling, because we know that kids with autism are systematically delayed in the onset of babbling. Many of them will not go through babbling at all, and if you don't go through babbling, you're not going to speak, okay? So another important thing to relate really speech to the other developmental scaffolds that have to be in place, okay? And again, speech doesn't exist in isolation. It builds on a whole load of things that have co-evolved over millions of years in the human body. Babbling is also strongly related to motor development, okay? And so this is a graph, badly photographed graph from a paper by Florian Koopmans van Beinum. And she basically looked at the onset of different motor behaviors, smiling, pulling yourself from prone to supine, crawling, sitting, pulling. And right in the middle there, I just pointed out with my hand here, right in the middle is babbling, okay? And it turns out if you shift those milestones in different babies, the babbling tends to shift also, which is evidence that babbling is really also scaffolded in the more general process of motor development. It's really the point at which babies begin to produce rhythmic motor behaviors, okay? So there's a point in development at which you'll see babies start to waggle their arms, they waggle their legs, they waggle things. They love to waggle things periodically, okay? And if you waggle your jaw, okay, you just waggle your jaw up and down, it will hit the roof of your mouth once in a while, and that will produce ba, 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 okay? So ba, 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 all you have to do is waggle your jaw, and you will end up doing ba, ba, ba sooner or later. Okay, and we know that infants with autism often have comorbid motor deficits. About 40% of them have comorbid motor deficits that impact vocal development. And many verbal children with ASD exhibit echolalia, which is this production of stereotypical rhythmic behaviors. In the same way that older children with autism tend to hand flap, and a lot of these kids tend to overdo these periodic vocalizations in ways that aren't really babbling. They really are something which is simply really rhythmic motor behavior that becomes speech without actually being relevant to speech development. Oops. Oh, what's wrong with this? Oops. It always goes too far and it's delayed. Come on. Okay, So we had a few papers. One I collaborated on with Ria Paul, looking at this in autism. And the two things that came out is basically that high-risk infants tend to produce fewer speech-like and more non-speech-like vocalizations than low-risk kids, even though they may have the same number of vocalizations overall, okay? And I said that as infants and caregivers interact, the caregivers tend to promote speech-like sounds in the infants by encouraging them when their vocalizations sound more speech-like, okay? And even though there's no reason to believe that caregivers of high-risk infants do that any differently, something about autism is really preventing those kids from latching on to preferring the speech-like sounds to the non-speech-like sounds, okay? The other thing that happens is kids, typically developing kids, learn very quickly you can produce all different kinds of consonants or closants, and they start to differentiate those different consonant types in ways that begin to resemble the phonological inventory of their native language, okay? And there's something called perceptual narrowing that happens around about the end of the first year of life, where babies' productions and the sounds that babies can perceive tend to converge on the language of their environment, okay? And they start to shut out sounds that don't correspond to sounds of their native language environment, okay? And that narrowing of production and perception towards producing sounds that are closer to the phonology of your adult language is something that happens naturally in typical development. It doesn't seem to happen in autism, and in autism, that differentiation, that narrowing towards converging towards your native language, producing less non-speech-like sounds tends to be disrupted around about 9 to 12 months, okay? And we know that canonical babbling towards the end of the first year of life is predictive of later speech and language outcome in ASD. So a child with autism or at risk of autism who begins to babble or produces more speech-like sounds, more consonant-like sounds, has a more variegated consonant inventory around about the first year of life will do better in terms of speech and language outcome down the road, which is one of the reasons why it's important. And this is the point at which things begin to get very interesting experimentally in terms of research. So why is that? Why are all these stages really being impacted by autism? Okay, what is it specifically about autism versus other disorders that really create that deficit in those kids? And there's a wonderful series of experiments dating back about 20, 30 years now, specifically by Mike Goldstein's group and by Catherine Bloom's group, showing the critical role of early social interaction, and specifically on contingent interaction, which we'll define in a moment, on scaffolding those developmental progressions. And what Mike did is he basically took two groups of caregivers with their babies, and the first group of caregivers, he simply told them, every time your child vocalizes, vocalize back, okay? Don't worry about what they're saying, don't try to respond to words or anything, just every time your child says something, say something back immediately. So the timing of their response is crucially timed with respect to the baby's response, okay? And he did that. And then he took a second group of moms with earphones in, and he said, okay, you're going to hear moms in your earphone. Every time you hear a mom, okay, making a sound, make a sound to your baby. And the soundtracks they were hearing were yoked to the original moms, okay? And yet the new caregivers were talking to their own babies. And so in this new group, the babies and the moms were vocalizing, but the caregiver vocalizations were not timed with respect to the baby's vocalizations. They were simply timed with respect to the other mom's behavior with a totally different baby, okay? The reason that's important is that in both of those cases, the number of vocalizations that the mom was producing was exactly the same, because each mom is producing vocalizations at the same time with the same amount, okay? The difference is in the timing or the contingency. Was the vocalization of the mom contingent on the baby's response or non-contingent, okay? And with those yoke controls, there were two very interesting things that came out. And unsurprisingly, infants vocalized significantly more frequently in response to interaction with the caregiver, okay? So the more interaction there was, if you looked at all those moms, some of them interacted more with their babies, some of them interacted less, okay? If you looked at the rate of interaction and you looked at how that predicted the number of times the baby was vocalizing, the more interaction you get, the more vocalizations you get. So the quantity of vocalization is modulated by the amount of interaction, okay? What he found also, though, which is much more interesting, is that the babies produced significantly more canonical syllables, okay, those speech-like syllables, okay, when their interaction was contingent versus non-contingent. So Introducing contingency or timing, okay, of the response between the caregiver and the infant stimulates not only the amount of vocalization, the quantity of vocalization, but the quality of the vocalization, its speech-like quality, okay? And many experiments have looked at this, and they've showed that as soon as you start to introduce contingency of response between the baby and the caregiver, things start to converge much more rapidly towards something that resembles speech versus non-speech, okay? Even though the amount of behavior may be comparable, okay? And that's really important because it's these were the first experiments that really experimentally manipulated contingency in interaction, and they showed that that contingency, which has nothing to do with the type of speech they're making, okay, and the moms, okay, the moms are simply told, make a sound, okay? They weren't told, say a particular word or repeat what your baby says, okay, just make a sound, okay? That contingency by itself is enough to promote speech development in those kids. And many other experiments have looked at this, and really the message that we're getting very strongly from our research right now is that those key transitions in speech development as infants move through those stages of speech development appear to be critically mediated and moderated by social contingency between the infant and the caregiver, okay? Now, in typical development, that contingency happens naturally, or if you have underprivileged families where the moms don't have time to interact with their babies, that can be impacted by the behavior of the caregivers, okay? And in autism, what we think is happening is that the autism itself is disrupting that process of social contingency. Something about autism in the brain of the developing child in that first year of life is impairing or impeding the process of natural interaction, the timing, the contingency of response between the infant and the caregiver. And that is what is basically having an impact on these key stages of development, because from our research on typical development, we know that that is one of the key mechanisms pulling kids along that path to spoken language, okay? So these experiments are very exciting. I'm going to show you ways in the second half of this talk in which we actually measure that. Go ahead, yeah, question.
You had mentioned that if the babbling is witnessed along the end of the first year, that shows that the child begins later on to have more success in language. If you see that babbling maybe along the second or third year, is that correlated to success later on, or?
So the studies I mentioned are basically looking at babbling towards the end of the first year of life. I don't know of a study off the top of my head that looks at relationship between later babbling and later language development in those kids. But many of those kids with ASD are obviously delayed for language acquisition. They probably won't produce first words until 24 or 36 months, which we'll see in a moment, okay? So I don't know about a study looking at the relationship between later babbling and later language development. The studies I mentioned really, that I cited, around about the end of the first year of life. So babbling at the same time as typical development is a good sign for those kids in terms of their later language development. I'm not sure what predictive value it has if you look at the emergence of babbling later on. Okay, good question. Okay, so this is great. I'm going to show how we can actually measure this, and I'm going to show how in our actual research measures this comes out very clearly. Oops, okay. And then after that, once we get variegated babbling, which we just mentioned, you start to get the transition into first words, where those different sounds sequenced in different combinatorial sequences begin to be put together in different ways, and that's where babies begin to realize that those sound sequences can be made to function as symbols that refer to things. You get the emergence of symbolic reference, okay? And then that is where babies begin to have first words, because those sound sequences that were just random sequences of sounds acquire symbolic function. And when a sequence of sounds has symbolic function, that is a word. It has meaning for the infant, it has meaning for the caregiver, and the caregiver can use those first words to do things in the world. And over the second year of life, okay, after first words, there is an exponential increase that plateaus in the second or third year of life in the number of words that babies produce, so the diversity of different consonant and vowel sounds that they're able to make. So when babies first begin to produce first words, they don't have all of the different phonemes and consonants and vowels of English, okay? Some of those are mushed together, and babies don't make all of the discriminations between different types of sound that you hear in adult speech. But as they move through that process of expansion, they also begin to expand their consonant inventory, and they begin to discriminate and differentiate between different sound types, both in their production and in their perception, okay? And so this is a really important sign that language is developing. If you measure consonant inventory in babies at this time period, producing a wider, more diverse, more variegated consonant inventory that is closer to the adult consonant inventory in their language environment. That's a good sign. It shows that they're getting what language is, okay? At this point, we know that one of the biggest signs of risk for autism that we see in our kids is that infants with autism often don't achieve first words before 24 months. And one of the first reasons that parents come to us quite often with concerns about their child is because they're not hearing first words around about their child's birthday, or if they wait a bit, 15 to 18 months, we quite often have parents coming in and saying, my child isn't talking at all, they don't have first words, is this a problem? And that's really something we have to look at, because this is a very strong indicator. And it isn't specific to autism. Okay, deaf children are delayed in first words as well. But on the other hand, it is something that tends to be a sign of risk that picks up a lot of those kids, okay? And again, there are studies showing delayed production of first words. Usually first words happen between 12 and 18 months in typical development, and many of our kids don't produce first words till about 36 months. And some of those kids end up being very high functioning. And so I had a teenager in my lab last year, and he didn't begin to talk till he was 3.5, and yet he's doing just great. He can speak just fine, okay? And yet his speech was very much delayed. He could actually read before he could talk. 25% of kids, like I mentioned, never reach first words if they have autism. And parent report of timing of first words within the first 5 years of life tends to correlate with functional outcome at 5 years. Even if we can't see the kids ourselves, if parents have reported that their kids began producing first words earlier, that's usually a better indicator of their outcome. And again, this is important because early production of first words, if the kids do produce first words, that is a predictor of better cognitive ability and adaptive behavior later in childhood. So it's very important we get those kids to talk, we get them through all those 5 stages of speech development up to first words and beyond. If we can drive them somehow through those stages of speech development to the end, we know they're going to be much better down the road in all of those areas of behavior that are impacted by autism. Okay, another reason why this is important, I mentioned that there are potential disruptions of the caregiver environment as well as the infant themselves for things that may have nothing to do with autism. This is a famous study by Hart and Risley that looked at the relationship between early language experience and outcome in kids, in typically developing kids and kids with low socioeconomic status. And they showed very clearly that there's a strong relationship between the amount of exposure parents give their kids to words and vocabulary early on, and the vocabulary those kids have later in childhood. And kids who are underexposed to language input because their parents are not able to provide them with sufficient language input will themselves show deficits in vocabulary development and language later down the road in ways that are absolutely replicable and very, very overt. Okay, and this is something called the 30 million word gap you may have heard about in literature between low SES and high SES kids. And we know that quality and quantity of exposure to speech predicts language growth and vocabulary growth in those kids. In their example, the problem was coming from the fact that the environment was what's not sufficiently rich in language input to stimulate language development in the child. In autism, what we think is happening is that those parents are providing an appropriate language environment. There's nothing to indicate those caregivers in the first year of life are not producing enough sound around their babies. But something about autism is preventing that input from reaching the brain of the child, okay? If you're not attending to talking faces, if you're not latching on to speech and language and it's not making its way into your brain in ways that are creating the scaffold for speech and language, because something about your autism is impacting those processes of social engagement, that input is simply not having an effect, okay? You may be bathed in language input all day long, but if your brain, because of your autism, is not set up to absorb it, that's going to have an impact down the road on your language ability. And so ASD, we think, really is throttling meaningful exposure to speech input in early infancy because it impacts that process of contingent social interaction that we said was so important in driving those kids along the path to spoken language. Okay, so just to summarize, and deviations in speech relative to typical development, even though speech and language deficits are not a core defining feature of autism. And all of these different areas which we've gone through, okay, these are things, there's 5 or 6 different stages of speech development that are different about kids with ASD, okay? And the specific missed milestones that you need to watch out for in kids at risk of autism relative to speech and language are listed here in terms of their production and perception of different sound types. Okay, and we said already they don't necessarily recognize a caregiver's voice by 3 months. They won't necessarily be vocalizing by 6 or 7 months. They won't respond to their name or perceive sounds by 8 or 9 months. Specifically, they won't begin to babble at 9 to 12 months, okay? And then they won't really begin to say single words before 16 months, which is the point at which you'd expect a typically developing baby really to have begun to produce first words. So this is an example of a toddler with ASD, and based on everything I've talked to you about, okay, I think she's 15 months in this video, okay, so 15-month child, what would you expect a 15-month-old to be doing around about this time point? How many of the stages would she have moved through, and what would you expect her to be doing? As far as Fred could just play them. Okay, we can stop it there. Okay, so that's my friend and colleague Army Klin. He's probably the best child whisperer in the world. And what did you notice about that 15-month-old? Not a single sound, okay? Worse than that, she's not even looking at him as if he were a human being. She's more interested in the object. There's no sharing of gaze. She's not even making eye contact, okay? What did you notice about him? He was trying very hard to engage her. He's like, right up there. You know, he doesn't do that to me, right? What about the way in which he was talking to her? What was that infant-directed speech? Yes. What kind of infant-directed speech was it? Baby talk, okay? He was using the type of infant-directed speech he would use to a 3-month-old, but she's 15 months old, and he knows that she's 15 months old, okay? So everything about her behavior is not eliciting the appropriate response from him. She's not responding at all vocally to everything he's doing, okay? And at this stage, you would expect a typically developing child, first of all, to be put off if you're right there in their face, okay? You wouldn't expect that kind of infant-directed speech to be used with a 15-month-old, okay? And you'd expect a lot more engagement and production of probably first words by this point, okay? So that's really what, and this was a child who went on to have a diagnosis of autism. We learned a huge amount from this wonderful baby. She taught us so much, not only about autism, but about typical development as well. So everything about that interaction is different, and that's created by her autism, okay? And her parents were wonderful, and they did everything they could for her, and yet by 15 months, this is what she looked like, because of that genetic liability that unfolded in the world through her experience. So just to summarize, before we take a quick break, okay, so why does ASD impact speech, okay, even if speech deficits are not part of autism? Well, we can look at other theories of local learning. So we talked a lot about production, okay? Perception, the ability to perceive speech sounds, also changes over the first year of life. And I touched briefly on the fact that by the end of the first year of life, by about 9 months, babies are born being able to discriminate and perceive all the sounds of the world's languages, okay? They don't really discriminate between Zulu clicks and English vowels, okay? By the time they get to 9 or 12 months, they've really begun to converge and home in on the properties of their own language environment. And actually, by this time, between 9 and 12 months, babies actually become unable to discriminate. Their brains are no longer able to discriminate between different speech sounds in other languages that are not relevant to their own language environment in ways that suggest that they've really begun to realize what their own language is. They've begun to acquire their mother tongue, okay? And this has to happen through a process of social entrainment, because the only thing thing that's different about those babies versus Zulu-speaking babies is the language environment provided by people around them, okay? So the baby's brain is absorbing language, homing in on things that are relevant and salient to their own language, and rejecting everything else, okay? So this process of social entrainment happens in production and perception, as we've seen over the first year of life. And many of those things actually also happen in other species. So birds, for example, also go through a process of vocal learning, even though they don't babble. And it's very interesting if we look at theories of vocal learning in monkeys, in birds, in all different kinds of species, okay? How does that happen? And if you look at all of that literature, there are three main classes of theory about vocal learning. Some species rely primarily on sensory experience, okay? You have to hear what your native language is or your native communication system is in order to acquire it. Some birds really learn the song of the adult just by listening, by auditory exposure. Okay, that's a no-brainer. You have to hear speech in order to be able to learn about speech, okay? Motor activity, other areas of vocal learning focus on motor activity, the fact you have to imitate or produce sounds yourself, okay? In some species, you don't learn to produce vocal communication unless you actually do it yourself in a particular way, and you do that through a process of imitation of the adult, okay? So motor activity is very important. You have to produce sounds, you have to use your vocal tract productively to produce speech. So babies who are intubated from birth because they have GI problems or problems with feeding quite often have trouble with speech because they are missing out on that opportunity to practice with their vocal tracts and produce those sounds over that developmentally critical period, okay? By the nature of autism itself, the core defining feature of autism is they have deficits in social engagement, which we now believe through all of those experimental studies is the key mechanism driving early speech development. Provide your child with an environment rich in sounds and sensory experience. Don't leave them off in the corner, okay? Spend a lot of time producing language input for the kid. Encourage your child to interact with the world by exploring and engaging in new motor activities. Those ones I told you about were really, producing lots of different sounds, encouraging their kids to produce lots of different sounds, okay? And develop your social interaction by encouraging them to engage with others. And that's the critical thing that we now think is so much more important than we believed previously in pulling those kids along the path to spoken language, okay? I just realized we didn't play a couple of the sounds, so I'll go back a few bits and just show you where that ended up in typical development. Oops, there we go, top one.
Baby. Yeah, baby.
So to go back to the importance of social interaction, over the course of a few seconds, the first sounds that baby was producing were baby, okay? They didn't sound completely like a word to us. The mom created that conversation, she interacted contingently with the baby, and over the course of a few seconds, the baby went from saying baby to saying baby, okay? So even on a moment-to-moment basis, contingent interaction is really pulling that child's vocal behavior into fully fledged speech and language in ways that wouldn't happen if that contingency wasn't really present. There are plenty of resources for parents who are interested in learning about developmental milestones. The American Speech Language Hearing Association has a website with lots of resources describing many of the things I've talked about. Okay, they're not perhaps in the same detail, specifically with information about other communication disorders as well as autism that will allow parents and caregivers really to start looking for those early red flags as they appear, okay? So we're gonna take a break there, and I'm sure you're overdue for that. Okay, so I think we're gonna go on till 11:15 because we started a little bit later because of our technical hitch, if that's okay. And I'll try and squeeze everything we have to talk about into that time. So for the next half of my talk, I'm going to talk about research on autism. And so I've tried to present a perspective on speech and language development in typical development as well as in autism. And I've tried to map out that process of early vocal development over the first 3 years of life in ways that look at specific things we could look for in developing children, and specific hypotheses about ways in which those processes of development might fall over in autism. And so in the last half of this talk, I'm going to present to you a whole load of new stuff, our research on autism, really trying to create a program that will systematize methodology, really measuring out in developmental trajectory each individual child, that will hopefully back into assessment and down the road. So the clicker is now. So spoken lab Center. And based on everything I told you, the big question in my lab is how does early social interaction drive vocal development? And specifically, how does that process fall over in autism? And we have a whole load of studies of speech production and perception, mapping out vocal behavior up to 36 months, going from all the way from looking at speech perception in the womb using ultrasound, mapping out some of those experiments I mentioned, all the way through 3 years of age and beyond. So we have a whole lot of studies. I'm not going to go through all of them today, just one of them, probably one or two of them. At our centre, we're also funded as an NIH Autism Centre of Excellence, and we've been funded for 5 years. That first 5 years just finished, and fortunately we've just been renewed for another 5 years. So pretty much everything I'm going to show you has been funded by the NIH under this particular mechanism, which we're very grateful for. In that Autism Centre of Excellence, we have 4 different projects. My colleague Warren Jones develops a project using eye tracking to map out the process of social engagement in the visual domain from birth to 3. My project looks at social engagement in the vocal domain. And then Amy Weatherby, my wonderful colleague down at FFCU, has a treatment project that begins at 12 months, looking at how we can begin to intervene in the domain of social engagement. And all of those go together. We look at the same kids, 350 kids, from birth to 3, and we try to map out that process of social engagement using multiple convergent methodologies. So I'll begin by talking about a little bit about social visual engagement. The reason this is important is when I was up at Yale, I began working with Warren and Army, they had a very mature eye tracking program, and many of you will have seen articles in Nature coming out recently, really documenting some of their results. And some of the findings in vocal engagement that I'm working on really came out very strongly from those early eye tracking experiments. I'm going to whiz through some of the eye tracking stuff quickly. This is Warren's work in collaboration with me and a couple of other people. We wrote a grant looking at this a while back. This is Warren looking at a little baby. Warren uses eye tracking to measure how babies engage visually with the world. And we had an experiment that we tried to look at why it is that babies with autism seem not to be attracted to talking faces in their earliest years of life. This is actually at 2 years of age. We're looking at toddlers, two-year-old toddlers. And we were trying to design experiments that would look at pitting faces versus moving shapes and speech versus non-speech sounds like modulated tones to see what it was about autism that was changing that process of preferential attention between the physical and the social world, okay? And so we created a whole lot of stimuli where we created geometric shapes that varied or modulated the shape in time to the speech. So we created shapes that were synchronous with speech in the same way the mouth is synchronous with speech. And we tried to preserve the same amount of movement and the same amount of audiovisual synchrony in the geometric and the social stimuli so that we could look at what it was about the specifically social nature of the stimulus that was modulating the process of attention to the audiovisual stimuli. So we have a preferential looking paradigm where we put faces and shapes, or shapes and shapes, or faces and faces on different sides of the screen, and we co-present them with sounds that are either speech or non-speech that co-vary with the visual stimulus, okay, to create audiovisual stimuli that are engaging, but where the engagement is either purely physical because the sound goes together with the shape, or it's social because the sound goes together with the shape in the context of a talking face. So if the gentleman at the back could play the movie right now. As an example.
I'm so glad to see you. Wake up, open your eyes, come to mommy. Let me see a big smile.
And then we have another example. Oops. Same stimulus, if you could play it again. Okay. And the timing is a little bit off in this particular display, but usually there's a very strong percept that the modulation of the tone and the shape on the right are going together. You don't really get it so much in this particular display because of the slight lag with the sound, but there's a compelling relationship between those two. And so we played those stimuli to babies, and we measured their visual attention using eye tracking, and we looked at how much time they were spending on the social versus the non-social stimulus, and how much that was modulated by the audiovisual synchrony between the sound and the video display. And we measured that by looking at the percentage of time that the infants were fixating on the screen as a whole versus the percentage of time that they were fixating on the visual stimulus that went together appropriately with the sound, so the face with the voice, or the shape with the tone, okay? We did this on a whole bunch of kids, 34 kids with AST, 20 TD kids, between 12 and 36 months, most of them around about 24 months of age, okay? And they were matched for cognitive ability, so we know that cognitive ability is not a confound in this experiment. There are all kinds of things you can measure with eye tracking. These are examples of the kind of measures you can use. And really here we focus on the overall time they spend looking at the social target as a proportion of the time they spend looking at the screen itself. So remarkably, we found that in the typically developing kids on the left, there was a remarkable preference for faces and speech versus geometric shapes, okay? And typically developing kids are just drawn innately from the first months of life, and certainly by the time they get to the second year of life, to just look at faces much more than shapes, okay? And our original hypothesis was we thought that the kids with autism would be more drawn to the physical stimulus, which is simpler. It's just a physical object, and we know that kids with autism tend to show attention to objects. We thought they would attend more to the object than the face, and actually we didn't find that. What we found in autism is simply that difference is washed out. They showed no preference for the face or the shape as a function of audiovisual synchrony. There was no preferential attention to the social stimulus versus the non-social stimulus, okay? And that was important for us because it shows that really that mechanism of preferential orienting to talking faces is really absent in those kids by the time they get to this age. And specifically in the context of speech, okay? Now, the problem with this, we're just looking at standard ANOVAs or t-tests for differences in mean response. It turns out that many of our measures have a much more interesting structure to them. I'm not going to go over a lot of that because it's basically about math. But if we then map out these two measures, percentage fixation time on the screen versus percentage fixation time on the face, we know that they live on a kind of a triangle because overall attention to the screen, which is on the y-axis, can't be greater than overall attention to overall attention to the face, which is on the y-axis, can't be greater than overall attention to the screen, and they're both limited from 0 to 100%, and so they live on this kind of little triangle. I've plotted the raw data there for hundreds of responses for those kids, and if we do kind of a grayscale image showing the pattern of response in typical developments in autism, this is what you see. So on the left-hand side, this is for faces paired with speech. Okay, we have two faces on the screen, and one of those faces is synchronous with speech, and we see how much time are they spending on the face that's synchronous with speech. How do they know that the speech goes with the face? Okay, and remarkably, on the left-hand side of the typical developing kids, all of the responses are right up in that right-hand corner. Further over to the right means they're paying more attention to the screen in general. Okay, further on the y-axis means they're paying more attention to the synchronous face. Okay. In the kids with autism, you see it's all washed out, okay, except for one little blob on the top that I'll come back to in a minute, okay? And so basically we see a huge difference in the pattern of visual responses, preferential attention to talking faces in AST versus typical development. And that also is true when we pair faces with tones. And so the TD kids pay less attention to faces and tones. They get the synchrony, but it's not attractive because it's not speech-like. It's not as speech-like as the other stimuli. And again, the AST kids just show this washing out of response. They're not really picking up on the relationship between the social stimulus and what's happening on the audiovisual stimulus. And then if we look at differences between these two patterns for the overall difference between them, so you can measure those mathematically using something called an F divergence, which is a measure of differences between total patterns. And we find a remarkably significant difference between those patterns in those two populations to the extent which we can actually create a classifier that can tell the difference between ASTs with ASD and typical development, and with a sensitivity of about 78% and specificity of 89%, and which is pretty good performance for a classifier. So preferential attention to talking faces can be used as a way of detecting autism using technology. And the interesting thing that came out of that experiment was I mentioned that there's a blob on the top right there which looks the same as the TD blob. Okay, you can see that those patterns are different, and yet in this particular case, which is not the case here, there's a specific area of overlap. And it turns out when I looked at all the kids who are in that top blob on the top right-hand side, those are the kids with autism who do better with language ability. And so the kids who prefer to look at talking faces, who get the fact that speech and faces go together in autism, even though that mechanism of preferential attention is washed out to some extent in autism, the ones who look more like typical development in preferential attention to talking faces turn out to be the ones who do better with their language ability. Okay, so that really motivated some of the programs we had when we came down from Yale to Atlanta. My colleague Warren Jones mapped that back to birth. So we started at 24 months, which is the experiment I showed you. And he then looked in detail at how many of those kids were looking at eyes versus mouths versus objects. Okay, and so we have developmental progressions for looking at specific regions of the face in single caregiver movies. And remarkably, he found that kids with autism look very similar to typical development at birth, but by the time you get to 24 months of age, eye looking in kids with autism is very different in those kids, to the point again where you can use it to discriminate between those two populations. So looking at the mouths and eyes and faces of caregivers, talking faces of caregivers, is disrupted over the first 2 years of life. That came out very strongly from 20 years of eye tracking research. And specifically, some aspects of that preferential attention seem to be related to speech and language ability. So in my program, we were really motivated to create a program, go forward, a program that would map out vocal engagement, social engagement in the vocal domain, okay, over that same time period from 0 to 3, to see how those early eye tracking results, that disruption of preferential attention to talking faces in autism, how that was playing out really in parallel in all of those stages of speech development that we went through before, okay? And so my project, we're really looking at vocal engagement, social vocal engagement from birth to 3, in the same way that Warren has mapped out social visual engagement. And we do that using Lena technology. Many of you may have seen this. So my colleagues and friends at the Lena Foundation, Terry Paul years ago created this wonderful little recording device that I'm showing you here, okay? It's a little recorder, and we can send out age-appropriate clothing to our moms every month from birth to 3 with little pockets in front. And basically what we ask the moms to do to 3, and really to listen in on that process of social vocal development in the home environment, in the environment the child is actually experiencing on a moment-to-moment basis for an entire day at a time, okay? So that's what my study consists of, basically recording babies once a month, one whole day, every calendar month from birth to 3, okay? And we're doing that, we've done 200 babies so far, if I can just get the clicker to work again, okay? So we've done, we aim to do 350 babies. We've done about 200 so far in total. At the moment, we've done 200 babies. We've collected about 3,000 recordings, 3,000 days of data from those kids. And we've got more than 30,000 hours listening to babies, learning how to speak in the real world over those first 3 years of life. And guess what? If I were to come into the Marcus Center every day and do nothing but 8 hours per day listening to every one of those recordings, it would take me 4.5 years to listen to all the data we've collected. And believe it or not, I have a life of my own, so I can't actually do that, but I'd love to do that. So instead, we use a supercomputer that is loaded up with vocal analysis software that I developed myself, which I'll tell you about. And my software basically can take those whole day audio recordings, munch and crunch them constantly. And basically we can look at not only the raw audio recordings, but we have vocal analysis software that can pick out moments where the child is talking, moments where the adult is talking, and moments where they're interacting, okay? We can also map out the full acoustic structure of the baby's voice as it moves from reflexive cry through babbling in the first words, like I mentioned. And we can also examine the structure of the caregiver's voice as he or she moves from baby talk and through all of those more complicated forms of infant-directed speech that we talked about earlier as well. And so with this recording device and the software we've developed, which is a bit like Siri for babies, okay? But I'm going to tell you why we can't use Siri for babies. It's really important. It's much more complex than that. It's very interesting. So we have like the equivalent of Siri for babies, but it's really Siri that's not listening for words. It's listening for social vocal interaction in ways that are relevant to testing hypotheses about autism. So now we can do that. We can do full-scale analysis of densely sampled longitudinal data from birth to 3 on on a very large scale, using 192 processors in this little brain of mine that sits there munching and crunching all day in ways that I cannot do. And we're getting some really remarkable results about how we can map out that process of local development automatically using technology in ways that 20 years ago would require an army of poor enslaved undergraduates sitting there hand coding data. And unfortunately, there are not enough undergraduates in the world to code my database. And the good news right now is that we actually have the largest infant local database ever collected, even in typical development. And we believe very strongly in sharing our data for the benefit of all the children we serve. And so now this database is used by lots of different groups, really, who are interested in other aspects of local development. My friend Kim Oller, for example, I mentioned him earlier. He's one of the top people in early local development. He has a grandchild with autism. He's now actually hand-coding many aspects of our data with his team to add to the value of this data. This is a wonderful resource. It's basically going to change the way in which we're able to map out and learn about local development. So not everybody has to go and run these horrendous longitudinal studies and hand-code data and collect all of this using old cassette recorders. And that's all gone now. We'll have this wonderful data to work with. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a part of this talk because I don't think we have time now to go through all of it. But the basic question when you're looking at local development is there are many different aspects of local development, like I've shown, that you have to think about. How do you characterize the development of the physical structure of the baby's vocal tract as it grows over time? We said that had a huge impact on how long they can breathe for example, okay? How do you characterize the development of the phonetic structure, the basic sounds the baby is able to produce even before the baby acquires speech and language, okay? How do you characterize the development of phonological structure, which is the moment where those sounds begin to acquire symbolic reference, where they begin to become not just speech sounds, not just sounds, but speech sounds that have value as speech sounds to adult and caregivers listening to the baby. And then most importantly of all, we're not interested in looking at this just cross-sectionally at one point in time. We're specifically interested in extracting meaningful parameters that parameterize the actual process of development itself. How is that baby and their vocal development, their vocal behavior developing over time, and how is that being derailed atypically in something like autism? And so the basic question, which is kind of a philosophical question, how do you measure the life of a child? Okay, that sounds like a terrible question. For me as an engineer, that's not a nice question. It's a tough one, right? And yet, through cool math and technology, we're now able to work out how do you measure the life of a child in ways that will pick up typical and atypical development and explain how it's happening in ways that hopefully we can communicate back to parents and caregivers. So if I had longer, I would go through the physics of sound production in the vocal tract. I'm not going to do that. And basically, we know a lot about the physics of how sound is actually produced by the moving tissue within a baby's vocal tract. And the key things I'm going to get you to take away here is there are three basic source mechanisms that produce sound within the vocal tract, and there is a mechanism of that basically fills those sound sources into the thing that emerges that the lips call speech. Okay, we're not going to get in great detail. So the vocal is like a column of air. It has resonances to it. Those resonances actually amplify and attenuate different frequencies across the frequency spectrum in ways that the movement of the vocal can then be used to control different balances of spectral energy, the whole frequency spectrum from 0 to 16 hertz. You move vocal tracts into modifying resonances of air column vocal tracts. And those are what we use really to put linguistic information onto the sound signal. Okay. Two different ways in which sound is like creation of the vocal tract. Sounds where tissue vibrates when low air through a particular set of little soft tissues like the vocal folds, okay, or uvula, for example. Okay, I can make a trill with the back of my throat, which is not this. Or I can do raspberries like babies do. Oops, it seems that first time I've broken the microphone with a raspberry. Can we turn this back on? It doesn't my raspberry. Oops. Are we back? Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry. That was unexpected. Okay. Such as the vocal fold, the uvula, the lips, for example, within the tract that can vibrate, produce sounds through the forces produced on the air. Okay? And then there's also turbulence, like for frequency, like shh or okay. Produce turbulence within the vocal tract creates sound source as well. Okay, for things like okay. And so resonance and two kinds of sound source. And there's a very famous thing called the source filter model of speech production. The source filter theory dates back to von Holtz in 1960, where basically all of the speech sounds that cover the lips are produced by sources of energy, either vibratory structures or resonance at constrictions, being fed by resonances of the vocal tract of that air column to produce what we see in the that comes up the lips. And so I want to characterize the sound produced by a vocal tract, regardless of whether it's a monkey vocal tract, a bird vocal tract, or a baby vocal tract, or even an English vocal tract like mine. Basically, you have to characterize the source properties and the filter properties. You have to characterize the spectral structure of those source mechanisms and the way in which those are happening. So, example, this is an example of what's called a spectrum of adult speech. So along the bottom, you have the time axis, and the speech signal measured by a microphone is along the bottom. Basically, you have the frequency axis mapping out the different frequency content of that signal, and the bars means there's more energy at one particular frequency than another. So it basically represents the time varying distributed energy at different frequencies from 0 up to 5 gigahertz over a period of 4 seconds. So this is the, I think it's the radio. I should say, Mercury using speak, one of these things that expedition engineers tend to produce. Okay, and the two things you notice about this adult speech is that though those dark band moving around, those are formants, they correspond to resonances of the vocal tract, and those are moved around by you moving your mouth. As you move your mouth, those dark bars, the formants move around, and the movement of those formants is what most of the linguistic information in speech is communicated via. Okay, so the movement of those formants corresponds to different vowels, different consonants, and you can recover those consonants if you measure that. The vertical bars you see as little vertical striations. Each one of those little thin lines vertically corresponds to the vocal folds colliding together during one vocal fold vibration, one glottal period. Okay, and if you measure the rate at which the vertical vibrations are happening, you get the intonation of the voice. Okay, and we know how to resonances, those formant frequencies, and the source properties, the intonation structure of the voice in adults. That's well known. We've known that since the 1970s. That's what Siri does, for example. It models the spectral structure of speech, especially for picking up words, okay, and doing words. In babies, that turns out to be very difficult. And the reason for that is voices, okay, they don't control their sources within the vocal tract. The source of the vocal folds, production of noise in the vocal tract through turbines, that's not fully controlled in babies. They do things you never see in adult speech. It's much more irregular. Basically, the baby vocal tract will produce any sound that can be produced by a baby vocal tract. Okay, adult vocal tracts during speech typically do not do everything that adults could do with their vocal tracts if they wanted to. I don't habitually blow up their raspberries, partly because it destroys the microphone. So in adult speech, it's easy to analyze because very rarely has a particular structure that's mature. In babies, that structure hasn't yet been acquired. Okay. The other problem is that most speech recognition software, this is the big secret of speech recognition, is not actually based on detailed acoustic modeling of the voice. It's based on guessing which word comes next based on lexical statistics. A bit like when you use Google, okay, it starts to guess what you're going to type before you're going to type it, and guess what, it's pretty accurate because the structure of English is highly constrained. So things like Siri don't work well with babies, mainly because the way in which the acoustic analysis is carried out doesn't work well for baby voices, and also because you can't do word spotting or lexical statistics on babies because they don't yet have words or a particular language. So what do we do? So this is a problem. This is a problem with speech analysis. Also, speech recognition systems nowadays work pretty well on your cell phone. Okay, they don't work very well in noisy environments or where there's multiple overlapping speakers, which of course is precisely what happens when you have caregivers and babies interacting. So the first problem addressed in my lab, using methods I did years ago, is we actually developed a new way of analyzing speech, which specifically looks for the harmonic structure of the voice. It specifically picks out all of those properties that are specific to voices and that are specifically related to the source structure of the voice. Okay, here, for example, an example of a baby us, and you see many other things. You probably can't tell this and without some knowledge of speech. There's a moment in the middle there where you start to see the dark line you see on the bottom is basically the fundamental frequency of the voice. It corresponds to the intonation of it. It's like a ooh. You see that little dark line move up and down. Here, something very interesting happens. You see the number of lines kind of doubles. That's something called period doubling, something that happens in nonlinear dynamics, okay? And adult voices don't do that. This baby has a sudden little kind of pitch shift, dysphonia that happens in the middle there because it's overblowing its vocal folds, okay? And so my software basically pick out completely all of the individual harmonics of the baby voice. It can pick off those dark black lines you see there precisely. It can use that basically to completely characterize the source structure of the baby's voice in ways that you don't typically do when you do adult recognition. Okay, we get the time varying amplitude and phase harmonic of the baby voice, even when he is doing weird things like raspberries or overblowing their vocal folds. Okay, so once we have, so basically we can get the periodic structure of the voice, we can subtract that off to get the noise structure. Babies quite often produce fricative or extra noise. They have breathy voice, okay, even during vowels, right, that you don't hear in adulthood. And actually, and when I talk like this, I tend to talk with vowels like this. You think I'm doing something strange with my voice, okay? Babies produce extra breathy noises in there all the time because they haven't learned to control them away a lot. And one of the uses of this kind of analysis is that when you see babies starting to control away that breathiness in vowels, for example, it's a sign they've learned that vowels shouldn't be breathy, and it's also a sign they've learned the motor control to actually do that and get rid of that breathiness. And so these are also indirect indices that can be used as measures of oral-laryngeal motor control and measures of whether or not babies are really in training on the adult properties of language. Okay, as an example. Okay, so if we have, can you play the sound there? This is an example of the kind of analysis we can do. This is like a little few second, like a 30-second segment from one whole day, and it's the data acting caregiver. If you can just play that for me. Oops. Sorry. That one, yes. Baby. Yeah, baby. So that was the example we heard earlier, okay? And here I've been able to analyze that. And the line you see on the bottom is basically the intonation contour for the baby and the adult, which maps out the kind of the intonation of that mom and that baby's voice. And most importantly, also is the onset, offset, the duration of every individual vocalization, okay? Just by counting up the number of ons or offsets, I can start to measure the number of times per hour that baby or caregiver is vocalizing, okay, in these recordings. And if I look at the timing patterns between, I see the extent to which the onset of the baby's vocalization is predicted by the onset of the mom's vocalization or vice versa. If there's strong statistical predictability between those two in ways you can find mathematically, you can quantify contingency or contingent interaction, the extent to which vocalizations are contingent one or the other. And you can convert that into an index of conversational terms, which most people call it, okay, there are different ways of defining that. You can convert it into an index of conversational terms that measures the extent to which babies and moms are actually interacting, okay? So, what does that look like? We do that. So, don't be scared, okay, this is going to be so this is the first 70 or so babies in my study, okay, and we basically started by just measuring the crudest statistics possible: the vocalization rate per hour, the volubility in the child, the volubility in the primary caregiver, and the interactions or conversational terms between them, which is the y-axis here. And we have our vocalization rate from 0 to 20 months. Every dot there is a day in the life of a child, right? But I happen to which kids are which, and look at that, okay? And these are all high-risk and low-risk kids. Oh dear, it's a big mess. We can't see any structure at all, okay? Same thing with the adult vocalizations and the conversational turns. So when we first plotted this, I was like, oh dear, this is too complicated. We don't see any structure. But again, if I was to look cross-sectionally at any of those measures, I would find a mush. There's really no structure from that. And if I label as high risk or low risk, I didn't see any difference cross-sectionally either. But critically, if I join the dots using some cool math derived from non-uniform sample theory, I can start to join the dots and map out individual developmental trajectories, okay, in every child. So now, with those kids where I join the dots, can I get a spaghetti bundle, okay? And the spaghetti bundle, oops, we get, oh, it's messy. happens to variability. Variability is not a problem. Variability is the essence of development and our behavior in the world as ecological organisms, human beings, okay? So what's happening here? Well, these are on a chronological time scale, okay? Months since birth, okay? Do babies know about months since birth? No. Every organism has its own developmental time scale. If you don't undo that developmental time scale or somehow quantify it, you're going to get differences in timing that mean that those spaghetti bundles don't line up properly. We use a method called functional data analysis, which takes groups of curves, spaghetti bundle curves like we're seeing on the left there. This is an example from a growth study, okay, acceleration of growth, the famous growth study. And what we do is we have an algorithm, a mathematical technique for basically trying to optimally stretch the time axis so that things line up in the best way possible. And if you do that, you can measure the acceleration or the relative lag of development in each individual child. And if you undo that time scale, lo and behold, in many areas of behavior, you find that things start to line up just right. So if you look at those spaghetti on the left, the growth curves for individuals in this original study, on the far right, you see what happens if you undo non-linear tiles of development, and you find that they happen what you would not have expected from the original data. So we do this, and in evolutionary theory, this is sometimes called the difference between allometry and heterochrony. So allometry is basically the way the change in scaling, which is a mechanism important for the development of an organism. But we know from evolution that heterochrony, changes in developmental time scale, either ontogenetically or phylogenetically, are also a critical way in which you can change the way in which an organism develops. And in autism, we haven't really quantified heterochrony properly. We haven't really quantified the individual variation in developmental time scale in those kids when we measure those behavior. And that's partly why we haven't had clean results coming out from months of behavior in the first 2 years of life. Now I can do that mathematically. So we revisit our data, and what I've done here is I've plotted child localization rate, adult localization rate, rate of conversational turns in our risk infants, 30 low-risk infants from birth to 24 months. Every circle, day in the life of a child, okay? Every one of those blue lines, blue curves, is a trajectory describing the development of a child, one trajectory in each of those three plots, okay? And if I take those spaghetti bundles, which look pretty messy, and I use cool math to line them up optimally using functional data analysis like I mentioned, those red trajectories bold are the overall underlying trajectories once I've undone the time scale of development and lined up properly. Okay? So I can low risk kids, high risk kids, okay, and if I flip back between, oops, because it's just too slow, back okay, you can see that there is the movement of that trajectory, which we're interested in. So, what happens in typical development? These crude statistics, the crudest possible statistics you can use to characterize local behavior. Number of times per hour in child localization rate, number of times per hour in adult localization rate, number of times per hour in interaction. Okay, we find in typical development everything starts once when those kids begin to babble and produce first words. Towards 24 months, the adult localization rate ticks upwards, the child localization rate ticks upwards, all pretty much at the same kind of time point. So, compare those with the risk, it's not the same, okay? And we can use statistical tests for differences trajectories, okay? And we find significant differences in all three of those measures, but happen at different time points, okay? So the first thing is in contingent interactions starting around about 12 months. So the blue curves, low risk, pretty much the same before 12 months. And then we see the low risk kids start to take off. They have more conversational interactions with caregivers, but the red trajectory doesn't. It kind of stays pretty flat, okay, indicating that about autism in those kids is not promoting contingent interaction as the local domain. Okay, 3 months after that, we find there's a decline in the adult localization rate. Okay, the typically developing children vocalize more once those kids interact more. That's falling over in those adults as well. Okay, something about the absence or the deficit in contingent interaction is not stimulating more behavior in the caregiver from 15 months. And then at 18 months, find that rippling out to the behavior of the child. And basically, at about 18 months, we're seeing relative development in the number of times per hour those children are vocalizing. It suggests what's called a developmental cascade, really beginning in conversational interactions or pregnancy around about the end of the first year of life, negative behavior, and the child's behavior down the road. Okay, it's very important to emphasize the fact that it begins due to risk for autism. It doesn't begin in the caregiver or in the child. There is no blame whatsoever on the caregiver in this developmental cascade. It doesn't begin in the caregiver's behavior. Okay, what we're seeing in the caregiver's behavior here is a downstream consequence of a deficit that begins in the autism of the child. That is an important question. There are three different ways we could look at graphs, okay? And we don't know logically whether there actually is a causal relation between those three curves. It could be like separate mechanisms. It could be the thing that's causing the children to vocalize. That might be completely different from the things creating that earlier deficit in contingency. Those are the things we learned. Okay. We used this hand coding, by the way, to make sure it wasn't an artifact of our algorithm. So we hand coded large numbers of 5 different in 4 kids, and we found exactly the same thing. So what we used linear causality, which is a mathematical way of measuring statistical causality between time series. I'm going to run this because I don't think you're really interested in math per se. Basically, the question we ask is, if I were to look at spaghetti with one measure, for example, combinational terms, before a certain time point, to what extent can I predict the statistics of the curves after that same time point in different domain? Is there information transferred from one set of spaghetti bundles from the past history of one of those spaghetti bundles into the future outcome of the other spaghetti bundle? I can have any possible pair of these measures, and I can do it in either direction. Okay, I can say, to what extent does child vocalization predict later contingency, or vice versa? And if we measure that, okay, we can draw the here, where we basically look at relative information transfer between contingency, human volubility, and infant volubility, and we show there's various information transfer, starting at the contingent interaction into volubility, but not in the other direction. And mathematically, we have a way of quantifying that what we actually have is a development cascade which does indeed begin in contingency, and it ripples out in the other direction in ways that are statistically causal, that indicate that something about early contingency is indeed predicting what's happening in child localization down the road. And this we do cause a cascade where those early deficits in contingency, local domain between adults into adults and children, are rippling out into both the adult behavior and the child behavior in that order. Okay. Now, if I take a topic, for example, families where the deficits in the you would expect that adult localization rate to exceed the deficit in contingency and child localization. It wouldn't be the same order. We wouldn't see the same patterns in that. Okay. This is evidence, strong evidence, that in the vocal domain, early deficits in social engagement or social contingency are indeed predicting later deficits in infant and caregiver behavior, which is consistent with what we said before, that early contingent interaction is the engine that drives the progression through those processes of speech development. And if you have an early disruption in contingent interaction of the kind that naturally occurs in autism as a syndrome, then for that reason, you get later deficit in areas of speech and language, not only in the infant, but also in the caregiver's response. Deficit interaction between the infant and the world, the infant and the caregivers around them. It's not just the infant, and it's certainly not just in the infant, and certainly not in the caregiver's behavior alone. Okay. So what does it mean? We can specify active ingredients for treatment, okay? We could have 3 different hypotheses about what you should do if you see this occurring in high-risk babies, okay? The type, I could just look at that type and say, oh, well, the children aren't vocalizing a lot after 18 months. We need to get the kids to vocalize more before 18 months. So you can give the kid an M&M every time they say bar, okay? Or you could do something that specifically targets the production of vocal behavior in the child alone, okay? Or you could say, oh, the adults aren't vocalizing enough after 15 months, okay? That's a very cruel and inappropriate message for caregivers of kids with autism, who we know are doing their very best to interact with those kids constantly. And you can see at that time point, they're doing everything they can to promote interaction through providing vocalization, okay? You could just say to the adult, oh, just talk more to your child, okay? Talk more to your child. And there are programs that use the Vena recorders basically to measure the amount of adult vocal input in, for example, low SES populations, right? Or say, well, we target social interaction around about 12 months, because evidently in autism, social agency is falling over around about 12 months. Our data that analysis shows that that is the right solution. Early contingency, if you change the trajectories of contingent interaction, that will automatically ripple out into those two other domains, because there is a statistically causal relationship between early trajectories of contingency and those other domains, okay? So this great example for us is the way math and analysis of large data sets collected in the home environment, logically valid environment, could tell us something about different strategies for intervention in kids. Now, in the new case, we're pitting clinician-based interventions in those kids, target vocal behavior directly in the child through clinician intervention, versus interventions that specifically skill interaction in the home, see whether or not these results actually adding up into the relevant treatment. Serendipitous, the study I mentioned by Amy Weatherby, which is project 3 of our ACE, is early intervention that begins at 12 months. Luckily, exactly the point at which that departure was first detected, even though we didn't know that when we planned the ACE. Her intervention is called early social interaction. It's specifically based on going into the home and teaching parents strategies for promoting social engagement, social transactions between the child and the caregiver in that routine in ways that will increase the amount of contingent interaction those children are receiving. And not only methods of picking up departures of behaviors relative to vocal development in autism using technology in the home, we also have some offer to parents when we find those signs. I think we've got about 10 minutes left before I have to stop. I go through lots of examples about the acoustic structure of infant speech. This is like infant cry, a very typical kind of pattern, differences in modulation of the acoustic structure of the child's vocalizations. And we can measure and we find departures between the example, like the fundamental frequency of their intonation, okay? They tend to produce higher pitches, that decline, that learning to use intonation towards 24 months of life. I want to focus on a caregiver response, which is something we didn't expect, just coming out very strongly in our data. Again, this notion autism is about vocal interaction between child and adult. It's not just about vocal development in the child alone. Vocal doesn't happen in the child alone. Everything I've shown you shows that part of spoken language through those 5 stages of speech development really is driven by interaction. The caregiver, the appropriateness of the caregiver's response over the course of time that matters, as well as the child's vocalization. So we looked, we thought, well, those were very crude, and yet we're finding a difference around about 12 months. We find a difference earlier than that. Is that the earlier you can go? The measure I showed you before had no notion of context, and we weren't looking at context-dependent behavior or specific contexts of interaction. So we started, for example, at crying. How do babies cry, and how do people respond to baby cry? And we said, remember, a long time ago that atypical cry patterns are not specific to autism, okay? They happen in other neurological impairments. But is there something cry which is autism we could pick up on? So we moved, on the left-hand side, we have the mean duration of baby cry, 1 month, 3 months, okay? Studying that critical transition with subcortical and cortical control that we mentioned. And we did find differences, very striking differences. There seems to be like a bimodal distribution where the babies autism cry longer, and many other aspects of the acoustic structure of that cry that we can measure this in those kids, okay? What was striking, though, is that in typical development, if you look on the right, we also measured the mean latency of response to cry. How long does it take to respond vocally to the cry of an infant when the infant begins crying with stress cry, for example? Okay? In typical development, respond pretty quickly at birth. Okay, very quick responding to cry, okay? So, okay, so at 1 month of age, you know, they're responding to cry. As the babies get to 3 months, the low risk babies are just quicker, okay? They learn more that you respond quicker to the cry, and you start to learn what those cries mean for that particular baby, okay? And then something interesting happens. Around about 3 months of age, the babies learn to control their vocal tracts, and they start to fake their cries. And they realize that cries will make mom come running, okay? And they start to fake those cries, and they begin to engage in what's called social cry, social engagement with caregivers. And lo and behold, the moms are not stupid, they learn that, and they stop responding as quickly. And so the U-shaped trajectory in the low risk about response to cry, okay? In the high risk kids, that's kind of washed out. Something about the vocal signal that those cries are producing is confusing, or it's not clear, it's not having the same effect, having the same meaning. And so we don't see that differentiation, that transition from subcortical to cortical behavior, which is standard in those low-risk kids. We don't understand what happens yet. We're trying to look at that in great detail. But this is an example of, if you look at specific concepts of behavior, focus on contingent interaction and the functional significance of the adapt behavior of things like cry, okay, in babies, you can actually find differences as far back as 3 to 5 months of age, even in something as complicated as full-day audio recordings of babies in the home. And I can tell you, I can't hear those differences by ear on a moment-to-moment basis if I listen to an entire day of those recordings. These results only come out if you use your computers and your machine learning algorithms and your knowledge of vocal analysis really to measure hundreds and hundreds and thousands of moments of interaction that accumulate over the course of time and that show up as differences in those kids. And this is also a key message, because many of us, Warren said this years with the eye tracking data, he's measured millions of fixations on kids on a moment-to-moment basis, even over a short period of time, like a 20-minute eye tracking session. And what we sometimes don't realize as researchers and caregivers is that babies are exposed to millions and millions of opportunities for social engagement every day of their lives. And the cumulative experience of those millions and millions and millions of opportunities for social engagement are what is shaping the baby's brain. We just do not appreciate the magnitude of the impact that those tiny moment differences has cumulatively over the course of 3 years of life. Okay? And so by shaping the nature of interaction between babies and care, you can promote those opportunities for engagement, or if unchecked, the autism throttle opportunities and not allow those opportunities to accumulate in the structure of the brain through a successive experience. Okay, I'm going to finish very soon. You have to come to everything. So we can go back to the first months of life if we know what we're looking for. Even though cry is not specific to autism, there are specific things about cry, specifically in nature of contingent interaction, that are specific to the body and process autism develops. How do moms engage in baby talk versus other kinds of interactions? And we show basically that infant-directed speech tends to be higher pitched. Okay, the moms make more effort when they're interacting with those babies. The more effort you put into speaking, the loudness goes up, but also the pitch goes up. Okay, and there's a transition that happens in the harmonics of that infant-directed speech that happens in typical development around about 12 months of age. At that shift, okay, from baby talk into those other domains, and lo and behold, that's timed. Particularly, it lines up with the increasing contingency that we see occurring in measures of contingency. So moms are also sensitive to contingency. They modify their vocal behavior in ways that are developmentally appropriate in response to changes in contingency. As you see, found through this of the caregivers of kids with autism is those kids are producing very confusing vocal signals. They're not moving through those stages of development. And some of them, they give up on trying to engage in baby talk or infant-directed speech. They realize it's not effective. It's not because they're bad moms. They're wonderful moms, but they realize it's not working. If your car starts to slow to a halt, what do? You harder on the gas pedal. Okay. If your car still grinds to a halt, you don't just keep blindly pushing on the gas pedal, you try something different. And so what's happening is something about infant-directed speech is not working properly. And then some of the moms just switch into adult-directed speech. They'll say, oh, do you want an egg for breakfast? What do you want? You want milk? Okay, and it's no longer infant-directed, it's just child-directed talk or adult-directed talk. Some of them moms persisted engaging in baby talk long after that would be developmentally appropriate. So like Army did in that movie with the 15-month-olds, some of those moms keep using baby talk to their babies through 24 months or 36 months of age, okay, even though the child is evidently not a 3-month-old child. Why? Because the baby is still producing signals that indicate it has not moved along past that process of development. Now, that in itself is dangerous, because I said that the thing that moves babies along development, caregivers attributing greater potential, greater skills to their child than they actually possess. But if the baby signals are so confusing that the moms are really not, or people in general are not getting that from the babies around them, they're not over-attributing performance to those kids, that's going to stop them from really pulling those babies along. And so some of those kids, if you do actually just agree to pretend they're able to speak even though they aren't, okay, that in itself might help to shift those babies along a bit. So I do have to stop almost right now. I think it was at 11:15 to lunch. Okay, even though we started. And the last thing, in research, you hope that you're going to find group effects in your data, because that means you can publish papers. Okay, you desperately hope, but do not necessarily expect, to find that your results hold up for individual participants, even in adult experiments, and certainly not in studies of infant development. And so a remarkable thing for me this data with our cool that even though we do get group effects, and I showed you those in those big trajectories, we also in trajectories of development that make sense on an individual basis. On the left-hand side, I have typically kids, 20 months, and you see that those individual trajectories for individual kids, even though their data they've all been messy, they're corresponding roughly to that uptick in those group trajectories I showed you earlier. Right, we have with them, okay, and one of them at the top looked like okay, 15 months, okay, and went down. And the other one at the bottom was showing signs of autism and showing signs of decline by 12 months, was actually randomized in our treatment study because they had red flags for autism between 12 months, and you can see there's an uptick in trajectory corresponding to the point at which they began to enter. So those are very different trajectories. They're consistent in the low-risk kids. On the right side, we have two different studies with those kids, but we can actually tell what's happening to those kids and measure it on an individual basis with these home-based recordings in ways that we couldn't. So here with the hope for this research. The message is, so we're hoping to turn this into a screening program where we can offer this to the high-risk babies, not only the 200 babies in my study within, but hopefully across the whole state of Georgia, because there are 5,000 sibling kids with autism born every year in Georgia. If we could just use these methods on those kids, the hope is that we're able to detect deficit in speech and language development before they actually become apparent to a human clinician and require intervention. We typically only if at 2 to 3 years of age, or in Georgia, the median diagnosis is anywhere from 4 to 6 years where you live, which is far too late for language interventions. Okay, so that's traditional impact. In our study, up to 36 recordings on each individual child. I can actually, with my math, reduce that to 4 or 5 recordings if I know what I'm trying to look for. Okay, and 4 or 5 recordings is something I can go to a mom in the community and ask to do around about the 12 months of life. I can't ask 5,000 moms to go and do 36 recordings one time every month. They're not going to do it. Okay, the wonderful moms in my study, all moms are wonderful, but there's a limit on what you could ask them to do. Okay, in practice. So it looks like we're going to be able to basically turn into a screening protocol with only 4 recordings and about 12 months of age, okay, which is long before they're going to get diagnosis in the community. Overall cost, if you factor in the overhead, about $120 per child. Okay, now you compare that with the cost of a treatment program in our building, for example, where counseling costs $60,000 to get one child to talk, if it can be made to talk. Okay, so this is a name. Are you going to spend $120 on the kids, or are you going to spend $60K on one kid? Okay, no brainer. About outcome measures, because this is also, like I said, for measuring treatment, but that's primary skip here. Important paper by Carl my talk, I hope you've got, is that the key to understanding developmental disorders is development. Okay, you're not going to understand a developmental disorder like autism by looking at babies at one point in time. It's about the ride, it's not about the roller coaster. Okay, very important. None of the results I've shown you come out at all if you look at one point in time and you don't factor out the influence of developmental timescale heterochromy on an individual basis. Okay, just not going to find it because there's so much variability in the real world, in infant vocal behavior, in infant development. Not a problem, okay? Variability, adaptive variability, the role that adaptive variability plays in evolution, in phylogeny, as well as ontogeny, is the whole mechanism by which we are able to confront the variability in our environments, okay? But if you're looking for something like autism, you're going to find it. If you're looking for variance at one point in time, you have to look at that structural variability. And to summarize, profile development through automated analysis of home recordings. I didn't believe that 10 years ago. I'm an engineer specializing in recognition and speech scientist dealing with adults. I thought that baby's complicated, never going to work. Now, I believe that absolutely every day in my lab. Cross-section comparison will always be confounded by individual ability and timing. Okay. Different local definitely emerge between low and high risk infants in the first life. Early signs of ASD appear not only in the infant's behavior, but also in the caregiver's response. Again, to emphasize, there is no element of blame whatsoever in our attributing any fault to the caregiver. Okay? If somebody asks what is the most sensitive instrument you can use to measure the development of a child, okay, they also say, the linear recorder, or an eye tracker, a really cool eye tracker. No, the most sensitive instrument for measuring the development of a child is a caregiver, a mom. Okay, those moms are exquisitely sensitive to the developmental state of their children. They are exquisitely sensitive to the developmental needs of their children. And if their response is different in children with autism, it's because they and we do not yet know how infants with autism are signaling their needs to the world and how they would need us to respond to those signals in order to achieve the same final endpoint of development. So the hope is through research we will begin to identify those mechanisms of vocal signaling or visual signaling in ways to have messages not only for researchers but also parents about what is it your child with autism needs from the world in order to get them to talk, okay? And what is it about your really extremely competent approach to interacting, which is great for a typically developing child? How does that need to be modified to accommodate the specific needs of a child at risk of autism at each stage of development? Foundation. So Terry passed away 2 years ago. He was the one who had the vision to create this device, which I use in all of my research, and which certainly is no credit to me. He really was a wonderful person. He cared very deeply about kids with autism, and he wanted his technology to be used for the benefit of those kids, which is what we're really managing to do right now. And of course, children and families, without them wouldn't have any meaning. Those are my people. I have a small team, but wonderful. We do so much so little. And then finally, thank you so much for being so patient with me.